Story 8 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 8. Running Away to Sea, from the Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe. In an ill hour, God knows, on the 1st of September 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. Never any young adventurer's misfortunes, I believe, began sooner or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner out of the Humber than the wind began to blow and the sea to rise in a most frightful manner. And, as I had never been at sea before, I was most inexpressibly sick in body and terrified in mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done, and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of Heaven for my wicked leaving my father's house and abandoning my duty. All the good counsels of my parents, my father's tears, and my mother's entreaties came now fresh into my mind, and my conscience, which was not yet come to the pitch of hardness to which it has since, reproached me with the contempt of advice and the breach of my duty to God and my father. All this while the storm increased, and the sea went very high, though nothing like what I have seen many times since, no, nor what I saw a few days after. But it was enough to affect me then, who was but a young sailor, and had never known anything of the matter. I expected every wave would have swallowed us up, and that every time the ship fell down, as I thought it did, in the trough or hollow of the sea, we should never rise more. In this agony of mind, I made many vows and resolutions, that if it would please God to spare my life in this one voyage, if ever I got once my foot upon dry land again, I would go directly home to my father, and never set it into a ship again while I lived, that I would take his advice and never run myself into such miseries as these any more. Now I saw plainly the goodness of his observations about the middle station of life, how easy, how comfortably he had lived all his days, and never had been exposed to tempests at sea or troubles on shore, and I resolved that I would, like a true repenting prodigal, go home to my father. These wise and sober thoughts continued all the while the storm lasted, and indeed some time after. But the next day the wind was abated, and the sea calmer, and I began to be a little inured to it. However, I was very grave for all that day, being also a little seasick still, but towards night the weather cleared up, the wind was quite over, and a charming fine evening followed. The sun went down perfectly clear, and rose so the next morning, and having little or no wind, and a smooth sea, the sun shining upon it, the sight was, as I thought, the most delightful that ever I saw. I had slept well in the night, and was now no more seasick, but very cheerful, looking with wonder upon the sea that was so rough and terrible the day before, and could be so calm and so pleasant in so little a time after. And now, lest my good resolutions should continue, my companion, who had enticed me away, comes to me. "Well, Bob," says he, clapping me upon the shoulder, "how do you do after it? I warrant you were frightened, weren't you, last night, when it blew but a capful of wind?" "A capful, do you call it?" said I. "'Twas a terrible storm." "A storm! You fool, you," replies he. "Do you call that a storm? Why, it was nothing at all. Give us but a good ship and sea room, and we think nothing of such a squall of wind as that. But you're but a fresh-water sailor, Bob. Come, let us make a bowl of punch, and we'll forget all that. Do you see what charming weather 'tis now?" To make short this sad part of my story, we went the way of all sailors. The punch was made, and I was made half drunk with it, and in that one night's wickedness I drowned all my repentance, all my reflections upon my past conduct, all my resolutions for the future. In a word, as the sea was returned to its smoothness of surface and settled calmness by the abatement of that storm, so the hurry of my thoughts being over, my fears and apprehensions of being swallowed up by the sea being forgotten, and the current of my former desires returned, I entirely forgot the vows and promises that I made in my distress. I found, indeed, some intervals of reflection, and the serious thoughts did, as it were, endeavor to return again sometimes. But I shook them off, and roused myself from them, as it were, from a distemper, and applying myself to drinking and company, soon mastered the return of those fits, for so I called them, and I had in 5 or 6 days got as complete a victory over conscience as any young fellow that resolved not to be troubled with it could desire. But I was to have another trial for it still, and Providence, as in such cases generally it does, resolved to leave me entirely without excuse. For if I would not take this for a deliverance, the next was to be such a one as the worst and most hardened wretch among us would confess both the danger and the mercy of. The 6th day of our being at sea, we came into Yarmouth Roads. The wind having been contrary and the weather calm, we had made but little way since the storm. Here we were obliged to come to an anchor, and here we lay, the wind continuing contrary, viz. At southwest, for 7 or 8 days, during which time a great many ships from Newcastle came into the same roads, as the common harbour where the ships might wait for a wind for the river. We had not, however, rid here so long, but we should have tided it up the river, but that the wind blew too fresh, and after we had lain 4 or 5 days, blew very hard. However, the roads being reckoned as good as a harbour, the anchorage good, and our ground tackle very strong, our men were unconcerned, and not in the least apprehensive of danger, but spent the time in rest and mirth, after the manner of the sea. But the 8th day, in the morning, the wind increased, and we had all hands at work to strike our topmasts, and make everything snug and close, that the ship might ride as easy as possible. By noon the sea went very high indeed, and our ship rode forecastle in, shipped several seas, and we thought once or twice our anchor had come home, upon which our master ordered out the sheet anchor, so that we rode with 2 anchors ahead, and the cables veered out to the better end. By this time it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see terror and amazement in the faces even of the seamen themselves. The master, though vigilant in the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear him softly to himself say several times, "Lord, be merciful to us, we shall be all lost, we shall be all undone," and the like. During these first hurries I was stupid, lying still in my cabin, which was in the steerage, and cannot describe my temper. I could ill resume the first penitence which I had so apparently trampled upon, and hardened myself against. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this would be nothing like the first. But when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, and said we should be all lost, I was dreadfully frightened. I got up out of my cabin and looked out, but such a dismal sight I never saw. The sea ran mountains high, and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress round us. 2 ships that rode near us, we found, had cut their masts by the board, being deep laden, and our men cried out that a ship which rode about a mile ahead of us was foundered. 2 more ships, being driven from their anchors, were run out of the roads to sea, at all adventures, and that not with the mast standing. The light ships fared the best, as not so much labouring in the sea, but 2 or 3 of them drove, and came close by us, running away with only their spritsail out before the wind. Towards evening, the mate and boatswain begged the master of our ship to let them cut away the foremast, which he was very unwilling to do, but the boatswain protesting to him that if he did not the ship would founder, he consented, and when they had cut away the foremast, the mainmast stood so loose, and shook the ship so much, they were obliged to cut that away also, and make a clear deck. Any one must judge what a condition I must be in at all this, who was but a young sailor, and who had been in such a fright before at but a little. But if I can express at this distance the thoughts I had about me at that time, I was in tenfold more horror of mind upon account of my former convictions, and the having returned from them to the resolutions I had wickedly taken at first, than I was at death itself. And these, added to the terror of the storm, put me into such a condition that I can by no words describe it. But the worst was not come yet. The storm continued with such fury that the seamen themselves acknowledged they had never seen a worse. We had a good ship, but she was deep laden, and wallowed in the sea, so that the seamen every now and then cried out she would founder. It was my advantage in one respect that I did not know what they meant by founder, till I inquired. However, the storm was so violent that I saw, what is not often seen, the master, the boatswain, and some others more sensible than the rest, at their prayers, and expecting every moment when the ship would go to the bottom. In the middle of the night, and under all the rest of our distresses, one of the men that had been down to see cried out we had sprung a leak. Another said there was 4 feet water in the hold. Then all the hands were called to the pump. At that word my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards upon the side of my bed where I sat in the cabin. However, the man roused me and told me that I, that was able to do nothing before, was as well able to pump as another, at which I steered up, and went to the pump and worked very heartily. While this was doing, the master, seeing some light colliers who had not been able to ride out the storm, were obliged to slip and run away to the sea, and would come near us, ordered to fire a gun as a signal of distress. I, who knew nothing what they meant, thought the ship had broken, or some dreadful thing happened. In a word, I was so surprised that I fell down in a swoon. As this was a time when everybody had his own life to think of, nobody minded me, or what was to become of me. But another man stepped up to the pump, and thrusting me aside with his foot, let me lie, thinking I had been dead, and it was a great while before I came to myself. We worked on, but the water increasing in the hold, it was apparent that the ship would founder. And though the storm began to abate a little, yet it was not possible she could swim till we might run into any port. So the master continued firing guns for help, and the light ship, who had rid it out just ahead of us, ventured a boat out to help us. It was with the utmost hazard the boat came near us, but it was impossible for us to get on board, or for the boat to lie near the ship's side, till at last the men, rowing very heartily and venturing their lives to save ours, our man cast them a rope over the stern with a buoy to it, and then veered it out a great length, which they, after much labor and hazard, took hold of, and we hauled them close under our stern, and got all into their boat. It was to no purpose for them or us, after we were in the boat, to think of reaching their own ship, so all agreed to let her drive, and only to pull her in towards shore as much as we could, and our master promised them that if the boat was staved upon shore, he would make it good to their master. So partly rowing and partly driving, our boat went away to the northward, sloping towards the shore almost as far as Winterton-ness. We were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship till we saw her sink, and then I understood for the first time what was meant by a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge I had hardly eyes to look up when the seamen told me she was sinking, for from the moment that they rather put me into the boat than that I might be said to go in, my heart was, as it were, dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind, and the thoughts of what was yet before me. While we were in this condition, the men yet laboring at the oar to bring the boat near the shore, we could see, when our boat mounting the waves we were able to see the shore, a great many people running along the strand to assist us when we should come near. But we made but slow way towards the shore, nor were we able to reach the shore, till, being past the lighthouse at Winterton, the shore falls off to the westward towards Cromer, and so the land broke off a little the violence of the wind. Here we got in, and, though not without much difficulty, got all safe on shore, and walked afterwards on foot to Yarmouth, where, as unfortunate men, we were used with great humanity, as well by the magistrates of the town, who assigned us good quarters, as by particular merchants and owners of ships, and had money given us sufficient to carry us either to London or back to Hull, as we thought fit. End of Story 8. Biographical Notes. Defoe, Daniel, was born in London in 1661 and died in 1731. He was a great politician in his time, but best remembered by his Robinson Crusoe. His political pamphlets, of which he wrote over 400, caused him to be imprisoned and pilloried, and his books to be burned by the common hangman. Among his other writings are The Memoirs of a Cavalier, Captain Singleton, A History of the Plague, and The History of Colonel Jack.
Story 9 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 9, The Tempest, from David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. In the evening I started. Down the road I had traversed under so many vicissitudes. "Don't you think that," I asked the coachman, in the first stage out of London, "a very remarkable sky? I don't remember to have seen one like it." "Nor I. Not equal to it," he replied. "That's wind, sir. There'll be mischief done at sea, I expect, before long." It was a murky confusion, here and there blotted with a colour like the colour of the smoke from damp fuel, of flying clouds tossed up into most remarkable heaps, suggesting greater heights in the clouds than there were depths below them to the bottom of the deepest hollows in the earth, through which the wild moon seemed to plunge headlong, as if, in a dread disturbance of the laws of nature, she had lost her way and were frightened. There had been a wind all day, and it was rising then with an extraordinary great sound. In another hour it had much increased, and the sky was more overcast, and it blew hard. But, as the night advanced, the clouds closing in and densely overspreading the whole sky, then very dark, it came on to blow harder and harder. It still increased until our horses could scarcely face the wind. Many times in the dark part of the night, it was then late in September, when the nights were not short, the leaders turned about or came to a dead stop, and we were often in serious apprehension that the coach would be blown over. Sweeping gusts of rain came up before this storm like showers of steel, and at those times, when there was any shelter of trees or lee walls to be got, we were fain to stop, in a sheer impossibility of continuing the struggle. When the day broke, it blew harder and harder. I had been in Yarmouth when the seamen said it blew great guns, but I had never known the like of this or anything approaching to it. We came to Ipswich very late, having had to fight every inch of ground since we were 10 miles out of London, and found a cluster of people in the market-place who had risen from their beds in the night, fearful of falling chimneys. Some of these, congregating about the inn-yard while we changed horses, told us of great sheets of lead having been ripped off a high church tower and flung into a by-street, which they then blocked up. Others had to tell of country people coming in from neighbouring villages, who had seen great trees lying torn out of the earth and whole ricks scattered about the roads and fields. Still there was no abatement in the storm, but it blew harder. As we struggled on, nearer and nearer to the sea, from which this mighty wind was blowing, dead on shore, its force became more and more terrific. Long before we saw the sea, its spray was on our lips and showered salt rain upon us. The water was out, over miles and miles of the flat country adjacent to Yarmouth, and every sheet and puddle lashed its banks, and had its stress of little breakers setting heavily towards us. When we came within sight of the sea, the waves on the horizon, caught at intervals above the rolling abyss, were like glimpses of another shore with towers and buildings. When at last we got into the town, the people came out to the doors, all aslant and with streaming hair, making a wonder of the mail that had come through such a night. I put up at the old inn, and went down to look at the sea, staggering along the street, which was strewn with sand and seaweed, and with flying blotches of sea foam, afraid of falling slates and tiles, and holding by people I met at angry corners. Coming near the beach, I saw not only the boatmen, but half the people of the town, lurking behind buildings, some now and then braving the fury of the storm to look away to sea, and blown sheer out of their course in trying to get zigzag back. Joining these groups, I found bewailing women whose husbands were away in herring or oyster boats, which there was too much reason to think might have foundered before they could run in anywhere for safety. Grizzled old sailors were among the people, shaking their heads as they looked from water to sky, and muttering to one another. Ship owners, excited and uneasy, children huddling together and peering into older faces, even stout mariners, disturbed and anxious, levelling their glasses at the sea from behind places of shelter, as if they were surveying an enemy. The tremendous sea itself, when I could find sufficient pause to look at it, in the agitation of the blinding wind, the flying stones and sand, and the awful noise, confounded me. As the high watery walls came rolling in, and, at their highest, tumbled into surf, they looked as if the least would engulf the town. As the receding waves swept back with a hoarse roar, it seemed to scoop out deep caves in the beach, as if its purpose were to undermine the earth. When some white-headed billows thundered on and dashed themselves to pieces before they reached the land, every fragment of the late whole seemed possessed by the full might of its wrath, rushing to be gathered to the composition of another monster. Undulating hills were changed to valleys, undulating valleys, with a solitary storm-bird sometimes skimming through them, were lifted up to hills. Masses of water shivered and shook the beach with a booming sound. Every shape tumultuously rolled on, as soon as made, to change its shape and place and beat another shape and place away. The ideal shore on the horizon, with its towers and buildings, rose and fell. The clouds flew fast and thick. I seemed to see a rending and upheaving of all nature. Not finding Ham among the people whom this memorable wind, for it is still remembered down there as the greatest ever known to blow upon that coast, had brought together, I made my way to his house. It was shut, and as no one answered to my knocking, I went by back ways and by lanes to the yard where he worked. I learned there that he had gone to Lowestoft to meet some sudden exigency of ship repairing, in which his skill was required. but that he would be back tomorrow morning in good time. I went back to the inn, and when I had washed and dressed, tried to sleep, but in vain. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I had not sat 5 minutes by the coffee-room fire when the waiter, coming to stir it, as an excuse for talking, told me that 2 colliers had gone down with all hands a few miles away, and that some other ships had been seen labouring hard in the roads, and trying in great distress to keep off shore. "Mercy on them, and on all poor sailors," said he, "if we had another night like the last." I was very much depressed in spirits, very solitary, and felt an uneasiness in Ham's not being there, disproportionate to the occasion. I was seriously affected, without knowing how much, by late events, and my long exposure to the fierce wind had confused me. There was that jumble in my thoughts and recollections, that I had lost the clear arrangement of time and distance. Thus, if I had gone out into town, I should not have been surprised, I think, to encounter some one who I knew must be then in London. So to speak, there was in these respects a curious inattention in my mind. Yet it was busy too, with all the remembrances the place naturally awakened, and they were particularly distinct and vivid. In this state, the waiter's dismal intelligence about the ships immediately connected itself, without any effort of my volition, with my uneasiness about Ham. I was persuaded that I had an apprehension of his returning from Lowestoft by sea and being lost. This grew so strong with me that I resolved to go back to the yard before I took my dinner, and asked the boat builder if he thought his attempting to return by sea at all likely. If he gave me the least reason to think so, I would go over to Lowestoft and prevent it by bringing him with me. I hastily ordered my dinner and went back to the yard. I was none too soon, for the boat builder, with a lantern in his hand, was locking the yard gate. He quite laughed when I asked him the question, and said there was no fear. No man in his senses, or out of them, would put off in such a gale of wind, least of all Ham Peggotty, who had been born to seafaring. So sensible of this, beforehand, that I had really felt ashamed of doing what I was nevertheless impelled to do, I went back to the inn. If such a wind could rise, I think it was rising. The howl and the roar, the rattling of the doors and windows, the rumbling in the chimneys, the apparent rocking of the very house that sheltered me, and the prodigious tumult of the sea, were more fearful than in the morning. But there was now a great darkness besides, and that invested the storm with new terrors, real and fanciful. I could not eat, I could not sit still, I could not continue steadfast to anything. Something within me, faintly answering to the storm without, tossed up the depths of my memory, and made a tumult in them. Yet, in all the hurry of my thoughts, wild running with the thundering sea, the storm and my uneasiness regarding Ham were always in the foreground. My dinner went away almost untasted, and I tried to refresh myself with a glass or two of wine. In vain. I fell into a dull slumber before the fire without losing my consciousness either of the uproar out of doors or of the place in which I was. Both became overshadowed by a new and indefinable horror, and when I awoke, or rather when I shook off the lethargy that bound me in my chair, my whole frame thrilled with objectless and unintelligent fear. I walked to and fro, tried to read an old gazetteer, listened to the awful noises, looked at faces, scenes, and figures in the fire. At length, the steady ticking of the undisturbed clock on the wall tormented me to that degree that I resolved to go to bed. It was reassuring, on such a night, to be told that some of the inn servants had agreed together to sit up until morning. I went to bed, exceedingly weary and heavy, but, on my lying down, all such sensations vanished as if by magic, and I was broad awake, with every sense refined. For hours I lay there, listening to the wind and water, imagining now that I heard shrieks out at sea, now that I distinctly heard the firing of signal guns, and now the fall of houses in the town. I got up several times and looked out, but could see nothing except the reflection in the window panes of the faint candle I had left burning, and of my own haggard face looking in at me from the black void. At length my restlessness attained to such a pitch that I hurried on my clothes and went downstairs. In the large kitchen, where I dimly saw bacon and ropes of onions hanging from the beams, the watchers were clustered together, in various attitudes about a table, purposely moved away from the great chimney and brought near the door. A pretty girl, who had her ears stopped with her apron and her eyes upon the door, screamed when I appeared, supposing me to be a spirit, but the others had more presence of mind, and were glad of an addition to their company. One man, referring to the topic they had been discussing, asked me whether I thought the souls of the collier crews who had gone down were out in the storm. I remained there, I dare say, 2 hours. Once I opened the yard gate and looked into the empty street. The sand, the seaweed, and the flakes of foam were driving by, and I was obliged to call for assistance before I could shut the gate again and make it fast against the wind. There was a dark gloom in my solitary chamber when I at length returned to it, but I was tired now, and, getting into bed again, fell, off a tower and down a precipice, into the depths of sleep. I have an impression that, for a long time, though I dreamed of being elsewhere and in a variety of scenes, it was always blowing in my dream. At length I lost that feeble hold upon reality, and was engaged with 2 dear friends, but who they were I don't know, at the siege of some town in a roar of cannonading. The thunder of the cannon was so loud and incessant that I could not hear something I much desired to hear, until I made a great exertion and awoke. It was broad day, 8 or 9 o'clock, the storm raging in lieu of the batteries, and some one knocking and calling at my door. "What's the matter?" I cried. "A wreck! Close by!" I sprung out of bed and asked, "What wreck?" "A schooner from Spain or Portugal, laden with fruit and wine. Make haste, sir, if you want to see her. It's thought down on the beach she'll go to pieces every moment." The excited voice went clamouring along the staircase, and I wrapped myself in my clothes as quickly as I could, and ran into the street. Numbers of people were there before me, all running in one direction, to the beach. I ran the same way, outstripping a good many, and soon came facing the wild sea. The wind might by this time have lulled a little, though not more sensibly than if the cannonading I had dreamed of had been diminished by the silencing of 6 guns out of hundreds, but the sea, having upon it the additional agitation of the whole night, was infinitely more terrific than when I had seen it last. Every appearance it had then presented bore the expression of being swelled, and the height to which the breakers rose, and, looking over one another, bore one another down and rolled in interminable hosts, was most appalling. In the difficulty of hearing anything but winds and waves, and in the crowd, and the unspeakable confusion, and my first breathless efforts to stand against the weather, I was so confused that I looked out to sea for the wreck, and saw nothing but the foaming heads of the great waves. A half-dressed boatman, standing next me, pointed with his bare arm, a tattooed arrow on it pointing in the same direction, to the left. Then, oh great heaven, I saw it, close in upon us. One mast was broken short off, 6 or 8 feet from the deck, and lay over the side, entangled in a maze of sail and rigging, and all that ruin, as the ship rolled and beat, which she did without a moment's pause, and with a violence quite inconceivable, beat the side as if it would stave it in. Some efforts were even then being made to cut this portion of the wreck away, for, as the ship, which was broadside on, turned towards us in her rolling, I plainly descried her people at work with axes, especially one active figure with long curling hair, conspicuous among the rest. But a great cry, which was audible even above the wind and water, rose from the shore at this moment. The sea, sweeping over the rolling wreck, made a clean breach and carried men, spars, casks, planks, bulwarks, heaps of such toys, into the boiling surge. The second mast was yet standing, with the rags of a rent sail, and a wild confusion of broken cordage flapping to and fro. The ship had struck once, the same boatman hoarsely said in my ear, and then lifted in and struck again. I understood him to add that she was parting amidships, and I could readily suppose so, for the rolling and beating were too tremendous for any human work to suffer long. As he spoke, there was another great cry of pity from the beach. 4 men arose with the wreck out of the deep, clinging to the rigging of the remaining mast, uppermost the active figure with the curling hair. There was a bell on board, and as the ship rolled and dashed, like a desperate creature driven mad, now showing us the whole sweep of her deck as she turned on her beam ends towards the shore, now nothing but her keel, as she sprung wildly over and turned towards the sea, the bell rang, and its sound, the knell of those unhappy men, was borne towards us on the wind. Again we lost her, and again she rose. 2 men were gone. The agony on shore increased. Men groaned and clasped their hands. Women shrieked and turned away their faces. Some ran wildly up and down along the beach, crying for help where no help could be. I found myself one of these, frantically imploring a knot of sailors whom I knew, not to let those 2 lost creatures perish before our eyes. They were making out to me, in an agitated way, I don't know how, for the little I could hear I was scarcely composed enough to understand, that the lifeboat had been bravely manned an hour ago and could do nothing, and that as no man would be so desperate as to attempt to wade off with a rope and establish a communication with the shore, there was nothing left to try, when I noticed that some new sensation moved the people on the beach, and saw them part, and Ham came breaking through them to the front. I ran to him, as well as I know, to repeat my appeal for help. But, distracted though I was by a sight so new to me and terrible, the determination in his face and his look out to sea, exactly the same look as I remembered in connection with the morning after Emily's flight, awoke me to a knowledge of his danger. I held him back with both arms, and implored the men with whom I had been speaking not to listen to him, not to do murder, not to let him stir from off that sand. Another cry arose on shore, and looking to the wreck, we saw the cruel sail, with blow on blow, beat off the lower of the two men, and fly up in triumph round the active figure left alone upon the mast. Against such a sight, and against such determination as that of the calmly desperate man, who was already accustomed to lead half the people present, I might as hopefully have entreated the wind. "Mas'r Davy," he said, cheerily grasping me by both hands, "if my time has come, 'tis come. If 'tain't, I'll bide it. Lord above bless you, and bless all. Mates, make me ready. I'm a-going off." I was swept away, but not unkindly, to some distance, where the people around me made me stay, urging, as I confusedly perceived, that he was bent on going, with help or without, and that I should endanger the precautions for his safety by troubling those with whom they rested. I don't know what I answered, or what they rejoined, but I saw hurry on the beach, and men running with ropes from a capstan that was there, and penetrating into a circle of figures that hid him from me. Then I saw him standing alone, in a seaman's frock and trousers, a rope in his hand, or slung to his wrist, another round his body, and several of the best men holding, at a little distance, to the latter, which he laid out himself, slack upon the shore, at his feet. The wreck, even to my unpractised eye, was breaking up. I saw that she was parting in the middle, and that the life of the solitary man upon the mast hung by a thread. Still he clung to it. He had a singular red cap on, not like a sailor's cap, but of a finer colour, and as the few yielding planks between him and destruction rolled and bulged, and his anticipative death-knell rung, he was seen by all of us to wave it. I saw him do it now, and thought I was going distracted, when his action brought an old remembrance to my mind of a once dear friend. Ham watched the sea, standing alone, with the silence of suspended breath behind him, and the storm before, until there was a great retiring wave, when, with a backward glance at those who held the rope which was made fast round his body, he dashed in after it, and in a moment was buffeting with the water, rising with the hills, falling with the valleys, lost beneath the foam, then drawn again to land. They hauled in hastily. He was hurt. I saw blood on his face from where I stood, but he took no thought of that. He seemed hurriedly to give them some directions for leaving him more free, or so I judged from the motion of his arm, and was gone as before. And now he made for the wreck, rising with the hills, falling with the valleys, lost beneath the rugged foam, borne in towards the shore, borne on towards the ship, striving hard and valiantly. The distance was nothing, but the power of the sea and wind made the strife deadly. At length he neared the wreck. He was so near that with one more of his vigorous strokes he would be clinging to it, when a high, green, vast hillside of water moving on shoreward from beyond the ship, he seemed to leap up into it with a mighty bound, and the ship was gone. Some eddying fragments I saw in the sea, as if a mere cask had been broken. In running to the spot where they were hauling in, consternation was in every face. They drew him to my very feet, insensible, dead. He was carried to the nearest house, and, no one preventing me now, I remained near him, busy, while every means of restoration were tried. But he had been beaten to death by the great wave, and his generous heart was stilled forever. End of Story 9. Biographical Notes. Dickens, Charles. Born 1812. Died 1870. As a boy he had a very hard life, and much of the story of David Copperfield is autobiographical. He became a reporter, and began to write about 1833. His chief books are Sketches by Boz, Pickwick, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of Two Cities, Martin Chuzzlewit, Bleak House, Dombey and Son, Little Dorrit, and Our Mutual Friend. Recording by Steve Chilvers, Norwich, England.
Story 10 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 10, Toilers of the Sea. Victor Hugo's Toilers of the Sea is a story of the Channel Islands between England and France. Gilliatt, the hero, was a seaman of extraordinary skill and physical strength, a solitary fellow who used to cruise about alone in his sloop, dreaming of Déruchette, the prettiest maid of Guernsey. Déruchette was the niece of Mess Lethery, an old sailor who was fast growing rich from the income of his steamboat, the Durande, which plied between Guernsey and the French coast. One foggy night, the Durande was wrecked on the Douvres, dangerous rocks in the open sea, 5 leagues out from Guernsey, and her skipper, Sieur Clubin, was drowned. The Durande, however, did not sink, but hung suspended between the 2 great rocks, and her valuable machinery was safe so long as the wreck should hold together. Déruchette promised to marry any brave man who would rescue the engines of her uncle's boat, and for so great a prize Gilliatt resolved to undertake the dangerous and almost hopeless task. He sailed out to the Douvres, and for 2 months lived among the barren rocks, suffering every kind of peril and privation while working on the wreck of the Durande. At last, after superhuman efforts, he succeeded in loading the machinery upon his sloop, and was about to return triumphantly and claim his reward, when a fearful tempest burst upon him, and forced him to terrible exertions in order to save himself and his completed work from being dashed to pieces in the caverns of the Douvres. Successful at last, but utterly exhausted by the struggle, Gilliatt sank upon the deck of his sloop, and fell into a heavy sleep. The famous story of his adventure with the devilfish begins at this juncture. A Struggle with a Devilfish, from Toilers of the Sea, by Victor Hugo. When he awakened he was hungry. The sea was growing calmer, but there was still a heavy swell, which made his departure, for the present at least, impossible. The day, too, was far advanced. For the sloop with its burden to get to Guernsey before midnight, it was necessary to start in the morning. Although pressed by hunger, Gilliatt began by stripping himself, the only means of getting warmth. His clothing was saturated by the storm, but the rain had washed out the sea-water, which rendered it possible to dry them. He kept nothing on but his trousers, which he turned up nearly to the knees. His overcoat, jacket, overalls, and sheepskin he spread out and fixed with large round stones here and there. Then he thought of eating. He had recourse to his knife, which he was careful to sharpen and to keep always in good condition, and he detached from the rock a few limpets similar in kind to the clonaces of the Mediterranean. It is well known that these are eaten raw, but after so many labors, so various and so rude, the pittance was meagre. His biscuit was gone, but of water he had now abundance. He took advantage of the receding tide to wander among the rocks in search of crayfish. He wandered not in the gorge of the rocks, but outside among the small breakers. It was there that the Durande, 10 weeks previously, had struck upon the sunken reef. For the search that Gilliatt was prosecuting, this part was more favorable than the interior. At low water the crabs are accustomed to crawl out into the air. They seem to like to warm themselves in the sun, where they swarm sometimes to the disgust of the loiterers, who recognize in these creatures with their awkward sidelong gait, climbing clumsily from crack to crack, the lower stages of the rocks, like the steps of a staircase, a sort of sea vermin. For 2 months Gilliatt had lived upon these vermin of the sea. On this day, however, the crayfish and crabs were both wanting. The tempest had driven them into their solitary retreats, and they had not yet mustered courage to venture abroad. Gilliatt held his open knife in his hand, and from time to time scraped a cockle from under the bunches of seaweed, which he ate while still walking. He could not have been far from the very spot where Sieur Clubin had perished. As Gilliatt was determining to content himself with the sea urchins and the chantagne de mer, a little clattering noise at his feet aroused his attention. A large crab, startled by his approach, had just dropped into a pool. The water was shallow, and he did not lose sight of it. He chased the crab along the base of the rock. The crab moved fast. Suddenly it was gone. It had buried itself in some crevice under the rock. Gilliatt clutched the protections of the rock and stretched out to observe where it shelved away under the water. As he suspected, there was an opening there in which the creature had evidently taken refuge. It was more than a crevice, it was kind of a porch. The sea entered beneath it, but was not deep. The bottom was visible, covered with large pebbles. The pebbles were green and clothed with confervae, indicating that they were never dry. They were like the tops of a number of heads of infants, covered with a kind of green hair. Holding his knife between his teeth, Gilliatt descended, by the help of feet and hands, from the upper part of the escarpment, and leaped into the water. It reached almost to his shoulders. He made his way through the porch, and found himself in a blind passage, with a roof in the form of a rude arch over his head. The walls were polished and slippery. The crab was nowhere visible. He gained his feet and advanced in the daylight, growing fainter, so that he began to lose the power to distinguish objects. At about 15 paces the vaulted roof ended overhead. He had penetrated beyond the blind passage. There was here more space, and consequently more daylight. The pupils of his eyes, moreover, had dilated. He could see pretty clearly. He was taken by surprise. He had made his way again into the singular cavern which he had visited in the previous month. The only difference was that he had entered by the way of the sea. His eyes became more accustomed to the place. His vision became clearer and clearer. He was astonished. He found above the level of the water, and within reach of his hand, a horizontal fissure. It seemed to him probable that the crab had taken refuge there, and he plunged his hand in as far as he was able, and groped about in that dusky aperture. Suddenly he felt himself seized by the arm. A strange, indescribable horror thrilled through him. Some living thing, thin, rough, flat, cold, slimy, had twisted itself round his naked arm in the dark depth below. It crept upward toward his chest. Its pressure was like a tightening cord, its steady persistence like that of a screw. In less than a moment some mysterious spiral form had passed round his wrist and elbow, and had reached his shoulder. A sharp point penetrated beneath the armpit. Gilliatt recoiled, but he had scarcely power to move. He was, as it were, nailed to the place. With his left hand, which was disengaged, he seized his knife, which he still held between his teeth, and with that hand holding the knife he supported himself against the rocks, while he made a desperate effort to withdraw his arm. He succeeded only in disturbing his persecutor, which wound itself still tighter. It was supple as leather, strong as steel, cold as night. A second form, sharp, elongated, and narrow, issued out of the crevice like a tongue out of monstrous jaws. It seemed to lick his naked body. Then suddenly, stretching out, it became longer and thinner as it crept over his skin and wound itself round him. At the same time, a terrible sense of pain, comparable to nothing he had ever known, compelled all his muscles to contract. He felt upon his skin a number of flat, rounded points. It seemed as if innumerable suckers had fastened to his flesh and were about to drink his blood. A third, long, undulating shape issued from the hole in the rock, and seemed to feel its way about his body, lashed around his ribs like a cord, and fixed itself there. Agony, when at its height, is mute. Gilliatt uttered no cry. There was sufficient light for him to see the repulsive forms which had entangled themselves about him. A fourth ligature, but this one swift as an arrow, darted toward his stomach, and wound round him there. It was impossible to sever or tear away the slimy bands which were twisted tightly round his body, and were adhering by a number of points. Each of the points was a focus of frightful and singular pangs. It was as if numberless small mouths were devouring him at the same time. A fifth long, slimy, ribboned-shaped strip issued from the hole. It passed over the others, and wound itself tightly around his chest. The compression increased his sufferings. He could scarcely breathe. These living thongs were pointed at their extremities, but broadened like the blade of a sword toward its hilt. All belonged evidently to the same center. They crept and glided about him. He felt the strange points of pressure, which seemed to him like mouths, change their places from time to time. Suddenly a large, round, gluttonous mass issued from beneath the crevice. It was the center. The 5 thongs were attached to it like spokes to the nave of a wheel. On the opposite sides of this disgusting monster appeared the commencement of 3 other tentacles, the ends of which remained under the rock. In the middle of this slimy mass appeared 2 eyes. The eyes were fixed on Gilliatt. He recognized the devil-fish. It is difficult for those who have not seen it to believe in the existence of the devil-fish. Compared to this creature, the ancient hydras are insignificant. If terror were the object of its creation, nothing could be imagined more perfect than the devil-fish. The devil-fish has no muscular organization, no menacing cry, no breastplate, no horn, no dart, no claw, no tail with which to hold or bruise, no cutting fins, or wings with nails, no prickles, no sword, no electric discharge, no poison, no talons, no beak, no teeth. Yet he is of all creatures the most formidably armed. What then is the devil-fish? It is the sea vampire. This frightful apparition, which is always possible among the rocks in the open sea, is a grayish form which undulates in the water. It is of the thickness of a man's arm, and in length nearly 5 feet. Its outline is ragged. Its form resembles an umbrella closed and without a handle. This irregular mass advances slowly toward you. Suddenly it opens, and 8 radii issue abruptly from around a face with 2 eyes. The radii are alive. Their undulation is like lambent flames. They resemble, when opened, the spokes of a wheel of 4 or 5 feet in diameter. A terrible expansion, it springs upon its prey. The devil-fish harpoons its victim. It winds around the sufferer, covering and entangling him in its long folds. Underneath it is yellow, above a dull earthly hue. Nothing could render that inexplicable shade dust-colored. Its form is spider-like, but its tints are like those of the chameleon. When irritated, it becomes violet. Its most horrible characteristic is its softness. Its folds strangle, its contact paralyzes. It has an aspect like gangrened or scabrous flesh. It is a monstrous embodiment of disease. It adheres closely to its prey and cannot be torn away, a fact which is due to its power of exhausting air. The 8 antennae, large at their roots, diminish gradually, and end in needle-like points. Underneath each of these feelers range 2 rows of pustules, decreasing in size, the largest ones near the head, the smaller at the extremities. Each row contains 25 of these. There are therefore 50 pustules to each feeler, and the creature possesses in the whole 400. These pustules are capable of acting like cupping glasses. They are cartilaginous substances, cylindrical, horny, and livid. Upon the large species they diminish gradually from the diameter of a 5-franc piece to the size of a split pea. These small tubes can be thrust out and withdrawn by the animal at will. They are capable of piercing to a depth of more than an inch. This sucking apparatus has all the regularity and delicacy of a keyboard. It stands forth at one moment and disappears the next. The most perfect sensitiveness cannot equal the contractibility of these suckers, always proportioned to the internal movement of the animal and its exterior circumstances. The monster is endowed with the qualities of the sensitive plant. When swimming, the devilfish rests, so to speak, in its sheath. It swims with all its parts drawn close, and may be likened to a sleeve sewn up with a closed fist within. The protuberance, which is the head, pushes the water aside and advances with a vague undulatory movement. Its two eyes, though large, are indistinct, being of the color of the water. The devilfish not only swims, it walks. It is partly fish, partly reptile. It crawls upon the bed of the sea. At these times it makes use of its 8 feelers, and creeps along in the fashion of a species of swift-moving caterpillar. It has no blood, no bones, no flesh. It is soft and flabby, a skin with nothing inside. Its 8 tentacles may be turned inside out like the fingers of a glove. It has a single orifice in the center of its radii, which appears at first to be neither the vent nor the mouth. It is, in fact, both one and the other. The orifice performs a double function. The entire creature is cold. The jellyfish of the Mediterranean is repulsive. Contact with that animated gelatinous substance which envelops the bather, in which the hands sink and the nails scratch ineffectively, which can be torn without killing it, and which can be plucked off without entirely removing it, that fluid and yet tenacious creature which slips through the fingers, is disgusting. But no horror can equal the sudden apparition of the devilfish, that Medusa with its 8 serpents. It is with the sucking apparatus that it attacks. The victim is oppressed by a vacuum drawing at numberless points. It is not a clawing or a biting, but an indescribable scarification. A tearing of the flesh is terrible, but less terrible than a sucking of the blood. Claws are harmless compared with the horrible action of these natural air cups. The muscles swell, the fibers of the body are contorted, the skin cracks under the loathsome oppression. The blood spurts out and mingles horribly with the lymph of the monster, which clings to its victim by innumerable hideous mouths. The hydra incorporates itself with the man becomes one with the hydra. The spectre lies upon you. The tiger can only devour you. The devilfish, horrible, sucks your life-blood away. He draws you to him and into himself, while bound down, glued to the ground, powerless. You feel yourself gradually emptied into this horrible pouch, which is the monster itself. Such was the creature in whose power Gilliatt had fallen for some minutes. The monster was the inhabitant of the grotto, the terrible genii of the place, a kind of sombre demon of the water. All the splendors of the cavern existed for it alone. On the day of the previous month, when Gilliatt had first penetrated into the grotto, the dark outline vaguely perceived by him in the ripples of the secret waters was this monster. It was here in its home. When entering for the second time into the cavern in pursuit of the crab, he had observed the crevice in which he supposed that the crab had taken refuge. The pieuvre was there lying in wait for prey. Gilliatt had thrust his arm deep into the opening. The monster had snapped at it. It held him fast as the spider holds the fly. He was in the water up to his belt, his naked feet clutching the slippery roundness of the huge stones at the bottom, his right arm bound and rendered powerless by the flat coils of the long tentacles of the creature, and his body almost hidden under the folds and cross-folds of this horrible bandage. Of the 8 arms of the devilfish, 3 adhered to the rock, while 5 encircled Gilliatt. In this way, clinging to the granite on the one hand and with the other to its human prey, it enchained him to the rock. 250 suckers were upon him, tormenting him with agony and loathing. He was grasped by gigantic hands, the fingers of which were nearly each a yard long, and furnished inside with living blisters eating into the flesh. It is impossible to tear one's self from the folds of the devilfish. The attempt ends only in a firmer grasp. The monster clings with more determined force. Its effort increases with that of its victim. Every struggle produces a tightening of its ligatures. Gilliatt had but one resource, his knife. His left hand only was free, but the reader knows with what power he could use it. It might have been said that he had 2 right hands. His open knife was in his hand. The antennae of the devilfish cannot be cut. It is a leathery substance, impossible to divide with the knife. It slips under the edge. Its position in attack also is such that to cut it would be to wound the victim's own flesh. The creature is formidable, but there is a way of resisting it. The fishermen of Sark know this, as does anyone who has seen them execute certain abrupt movements in the sea. The porpoises know it also. They have a way of biting the cuttlefish which decapitates it, hence the frequent sight on the sea of penfish, pulps, and cuttlefish without heads. The devilfish, in fact, is only vulnerable through the head. Gilliatt was not ignorant of this fact. With the devilfish, as with a furious bull, there is a certain moment in the conflict which must be seized. It is the instant when the devilfish advances its head. The movement is rapid. He who loses that moment is destroyed. The things we have described occupied only a few moments. Gilliatt, however, felt the increasing power of its innumerable suckers. The monster is cunning. It tries first to stupefy its prey. It seizes and then pauses a while. Gilliatt grasped his knife. The sucking increased. He looked at the monster, which seemed to look at him. Suddenly it loosened from the rock its sixth antenna, and darted it at him, seized him by the left arm. At the same moment it advanced its head with a violent movement. In 1 second more its mouth would have fastened on his breast. Bleeding in the sides, and with his 2 arms entangled, he would have been a dead man. But Gilliatt was watchful. He avoided the antenna, and at the moment when the monster darted forward to fasten on his breast, he struck it with the knife clenched in his left hand. There were 2 convulsions in opposite directions, that of the devilfish and that of its prey. The movement was rapid as a double flash of lightning. He had plunged the blade of his knife into the flat, slimy substance, and by a rapid movement, like the flourish of a whip in the air, describing a circle around the 2 eyes, he wrenched the head off as a man would draw a tooth. The struggle was ended. The folds relaxed. The monster dropped away like the slow detaching of bands. The 400 suckers, deprived of their sustaining power, dropped at once from the man and the rock. The mass sank to the bottom of the water. Breathless with the struggle, Gilliatt could perceive upon the stones at his feet 2 shapeless, slimy heaps, the head on one side, the remainder of the monster on the other. Fearing, nevertheless, some convulsive return of his agony, he recoiled to avoid the reach of the dreaded tentacles. But the monster was quite dead. Gilliatt closed his knife. It was time that he killed the devilfish. He was almost suffocated. His right arm and his chest were purple. Numberless little swellings were distinguishable upon them. The blood flowed from them here and there. The remedy for these wounds is sea-water. Gilliatt plunged into it, rubbing himself at the same time with the palms of his hands. The swellings disappeared under the friction. End of Story 10. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.
Story 11 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 11, The Man in the Cannon, from 93 by Victor Hugo. One of the cannonades of the battery, a 24-pounder, had broken loose. This is the most dangerous accident that can possibly take place on shipboard. Nothing more terrible can happen to a sloop of war in open sea and under full sail. A cannon that breaks its moorings suddenly becomes some strange, supernatural beast. It is a machine transformed into a monster. That short mass on wheels moves like a billiard ball, rolls with the rolling of the ship, plunges with the pitching, goes, comes, stops, seems to meditate, starts on its course again, shoots like an arrow from one end of the vessel to the other, whirls around, slips away, dodges, rears, bangs, crashes, kills, exterminates. It is a battering ram capriciously assaulting a wall. Add to this the fact that the ram is of metal, the wall of wood. It is matter set free, one might say. This eternal slave was avenging itself. It seemed as if the total depravity concealed in what we call inanimate things had escaped, and burst forth all of a sudden. It appears to lose patience, and to take a strange, mysterious revenge. Nothing more restless than this wrath of the inanimate. This enraged lump leaps like a panther. It has the clumsiness of an elephant, the nimbleness of a mouse, the obstinacy of an axe, the uncertainty of the billows, the zigzag of the lightning, the deftness of the grave. It weighs 10,000 pounds, and it rebounds like a child's ball. It spins, and then abruptly darts off at right angles. And what is to be done? How put an end to it? The tempest ceases, a cyclone passes over, a wind dies down, a broken mast can be replaced, a leak can be stopped, a fire extinguished. But what will become of this enormous brute of bronze? How can it be captured? You can reason with a bulldog, astonish a bull, fascinate a boa, frighten a tiger, tame a lion, but you have no resource against this monster. A loose cannon. You cannot kill it. It is dead, and at the same time it lives. It lives with a sinister life which comes to it from the infinite. The deck beneath gives it full swing. It is moved by the ship, which is moved by the sea, which is moved by the wind. This destroyer is a toy. The ship, the waves, the winds, all play with it. Hence its frightful animation. What is done with this apparatus? How fetter this stupendous engine of destruction? How anticipate its comings and goings, its returns, its stops, its shocks? Any one of its blows on the side of the ship may stave it in. How foretell its frightful meanderings? It is dealing with a projectile, which alters its mind, which seems to have ideas and changes its direction every instant. How check the course of what must be avoided? The horrible cannon struggles, advances, backs, strikes right, strikes left, retreats, passes by, disconcerts expectation, grinds up obstacles, crushes men like flies. All the terror of the situation is in the fluctuations of the flooring. How fight an inclined plane subject to caprices? The ship has, so to speak, in its belly, an imprisoned thunderstorm, striving to escape, something like a thunderbolt rumbling above an earthquake. In an instant the whole crew was on foot. It was the fault of the gun captain, who had neglected to fasten the screw nut of the mooring chain, and had insecurely clogged the four wheels of the gun carriage. This gave play to the sole and the framework, separated the two platforms, and finally the breeching. The tackle had given way, so that the cannon was no longer firm on its carriage. The stationary breeching, which prevents recoil, was not in use at this time. A heavy sea struck the port. The cannonade, insecurely fastened, had recoiled and broken its chain, and begun its terrible course over the deck. To form an idea of this strange sliding, let one imagine a drop of water running over glass. At the moment when the fastenings gave way, the gunners were in the battery, some in groups, others scattered about, busied with the customary work among sailors getting ready for a signal for action. The cannonade, hurled forward by the pitching of the vessel, made a gap in this crowd of men and crushed four at the first blow. Then sliding back and shot out again as the ship rolled, it cut in two a fifth unfortunate, and knocked a piece of the battery against the larboard side with such force as to unship it. This caused the cry of distress just heard. All the men rushed to the companionway. The gun deck was vacated in a twinkling. The enormous gun was left alone. It was given up to itself. It was its own master, the master of the ship. It could do what it pleased. This whole crew, accustomed to laugh in time of battle, now trembled. To describe the terror is impossible. Captain Boisberthelot and Lieutenant La Vieuville, although both dauntless men, stopped at the head of the companionway, and dumb, pale, and hesitating, looked down on the deck below. Someone elbowed past and went down. It was their passenger, the peasant, the man on whom they had just been speaking a moment before. Reaching the foot of the companionway, he stopped. The cannon was rushing back and forth on the deck. One might have supposed it to be a living chariot of the apocalypse. The marine lantern, swinging overhead, added a dizzying shift of light and shade to the picture. The form of the cannon disappeared in the violence of its course, and it looked now black in the light, now mysteriously white in the darkness. It went on in its destructive work. It had already shattered four other guns and made two gaps in the side of the ship, fortunately above the water line, but where the water would come in case of heavy weather. It rushed frantically against the framework. The strong timbers withstood the shock. The curved shape of the wood gave them great power of resistance, but they creaked beneath the blows of this huge club, beating on all sides at once with a strange sort of ubiquity. The percussions of a grain of shot shaken in a bottle are not swifter or more senseless. The four wheels passed back and forth over the dead men, cutting them, carving them, slashing them, till the 5 corpses were a score of stumps, rolling across the deck. The heads of the dead men seemed to cry out. Streams of blood curled over the deck with the rolling of the vessel. The planks, damaged in several places, began to gape open. The whole ship was filled with the horrid noise and confusion. The captain promptly recovered his presence of mind, and ordered everything that could check and impede the cannon's mad course to be thrown through the hatchway down on the gun deck. Mattresses, hammocks, spare sails, rolls of cordage, bags belonging to the crew, the bales of counterfeit assignats, of which the corvette carried a large quantity, a characteristic piece of English villainy regarded as legitimate warfare. But what could these rags do? As nobody dared to go below to dispose of them properly, they were reduced to lint in a few minutes. There was just enough sea to make the accident as bad as possible. A tempest would have been desirable, for it might have upset the cannon, and with its 4 wheels once in the air, there would be some hope of getting it under control. Meanwhile, the havoc increased. There were splits and fractures in the masts, which are set into the framework of the keel, and rise above the decks of a ship like great round pillars. The convulsive blows of the cannon had cracked the mizzenmast, and had cut into the mainmast. The battery was being ruined. 10 pieces out of the 30 were disabled. The breaches in the side of the vessel were increasing. The corvette was beginning to leak. The old passenger, having gone down to the gun deck, stood like a man of stone at the foot of the steps. He cast a stern glance over this scene of devastation. He did not move. It seemed impossible to take a step forward. Every movement of the loose cannonade threatened the ship's destruction. A few moments more, and shipwreck would be inevitable. They must perish or put a speedy end to the disaster. Some course must be decided on, but what? What an opponent was this cannonade! Something must be done to stop this terrible madness, to capture this lightning, to overthrow this thunderbolt. Boisberthelot said to La Vieuville, "Do you believe in God, Chevalier?" La Vieuville replied, "Yes, no, sometimes." "During a tempest?" "Yes, and in moments like this." "God alone can save us from this," said Boisberthelot. Everybody was silent, letting the cannonade continue its horrible din. Outside, the waves beating against the ship responded with their blows to the shocks of the cannon. It was like 2 hammers alternating. Suddenly, in the midst of this inaccessible ring, where the escaped cannon was leaping, a man was seen to appear, with an iron bar in his hand. He was the author of the catastrophe, the captain of the gun, guilty of criminal carelessness, and the cause of the accident, the master of the cannonade. Having done the mischief, he was anxious to repair it. He had seized the iron bar in one hand, a tiller rope with a slip noose in the other, and jumped down the hatchway to the gun deck. Then began an awful sight, a titanic scene, the contest between gun and gunner, the battle of matter and intelligence, the duel between man and the inanimate. The man stationed himself in a corner, and with bar and rope in his 2 hands, he leaned against one of the riders, bracing himself on his legs, which seemed 2 steel posts, and livid, calm, tragic, as if rooted to the deck, he waited. He waited for the cannon to pass by him. The gunner knew his gun, and it seemed to him as if the gun ought to know him. He had lived long with it. How many times he had thrust his hands into its mouth! It was his own familiar monster. He began to speak to it as if it were his dog. "Come," he said. Perhaps he loved it. He seemed to wish it to come to him. But to come to him was to come upon him, and then he would be lost. How could he avoid being crushed? That was the question. All looked on in terror. Not a breast breathed freely, unless perhaps that of the old man, who was alone in the battery with the 2 contestants, a stern witness. He might be crushed himself by the cannon. He did not stir. Beneath them the sea blindly directed the contest. At the moment when the gunner, accepting his frightful hand-to-hand conflict, challenged the cannon, some chance rocking of the sea caused the cannonade to remain for an instant motionless, and as if stupefied. "Come now," said the man. It seemed to listen. Suddenly it leapt towards him. The man dodged the blow. The battle began, battle unprecedented. Frailty struggled against the invulnerable. The gladiator of flesh attacking the beast of brass. On one side brute force, on the other a human soul. All this was taking place in semi-darkness. It was like the shadowy vision of a miracle. A soul! Strange to say, one would have thought the cannon also had a soul, but a soul full of hatred and rage. This sightless thing seemed to have eyes. The monster appeared to lie in wait for the man. One would have at least believed that there was a craft in this mass. It also chose its time. It was a strange, gigantic insect of metal, having or seeming to have the will of a demon. For a moment this colossal locust would beat against the low ceiling overhead. Then it would come down on its four wheels like a tiger on its four paws, and begin to run at the man. He, supple, nimble, expert, writhed away like an adder from all these lightning movements. He avoided a collision, but the blows which he parried fell against the vessel, and continued their work of destruction. An end of broken chain was left hanging to the carronade. This chain had in some strange way become twisted about the screw of the cascabel. One end of the chain was fastened to the gun carriage. The other, left loose, whirled desperately about the cannon, making all its blows more dangerous. The screw held it in a firm grip, adding a thong to a battering ram, making a terrible whirlwind around the cannon, an iron lash in a brazen hand. This chain complicated the contest. However, the man went on fighting. Occasionally it was the man who attacked the cannon. He would creep along the side of the vessel, bar and rope in hand, and the cannon, as if it understood, and as though suspecting some snare, would flee away. The man, bent on victory, pursued it. Such things cannot long continue. The cannon seemed to say to itself, all of a sudden, "Come now, make an end of it," and it stopped. One felt that the crisis was at hand. The cannon, as if in suspense, seemed to have, or really had, for to all it was a living being, a ferocious malice prepense. It made a sudden quick dash at the gunner. The gunner sprang out of the way, let it pass by, and cried out to it with a laugh, "Try it again!" The cannon, as if enraged, smashed a cannonade on the port side, and then again, seized by the invisible sling which controlled it, it was hurled to the starboard side, at the man who made his escape. 3 cannonades gave way under the blows of the cannon, then, as if blind and not knowing what more to do, turned its back on the man, rolled from stern to bow, injured the stern, and made a breach in the planking of the prow. The man took refuge at the foot of the steps, not far from the old man who was looking on. The gunner held his iron bar in rest. The cannon seemed to notice it, and without taking the trouble to turn around, slid back on the man, swift as the blow of an axe. The man, driven against the side of the ship, was lost. The whole crew cried out with horror, but the old passenger, till this moment motionless, darted forth more quickly than any of this wildly swift rapidity. He seized a package of the counterfeit assignats, and at the risk of being crushed, succeeded in throwing it between the wheels of the cannonade. This decisive and perilous movement could not have been made with more exactness and precision by a man trained in all the exercises described in Durosell's Manual of Gun Practice at Sea. The package had the effect of a clog. A pebble may stop a log. The branch of a tree turn aside an avalanche. The cannonade stumbled. The gunner, taking advantage of this critical opportunity, plunged his iron bar between the spokes of one of the hind wheels. The cannon stopped. It leaned forward. The man, using the bar as a lever, held it in equilibrium. The heavy mass was overthrown, with the crash of a falling bell, and the man, rushing with all his might, dripping with perspiration, passed the slip noose around the bronze neck of the subdued monster. It was ended. The man had conquered. The ant had control over the mastodon. The pygmy had taken the thunderbolt prisoner. The mariners and sailors clapped their hands. The whole crew rushed forward with cables and chains, and in an instant the cannon was secured. The gunner saluted the passenger. "Sir," he said, "you have saved my life." The old man had resumed his impassive attitude, and made no reply. End of Story 11.
Story 12 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 12. A Ship on Fire at Sea. From Off the Skelligs, by Jean Ingelow. "What is it?" I exclaimed. "What can it be?" She pointed with her finger, and as the yacht swung round, she said, "Look there, ma'am, look." As she spoke, two strange objects came into my view. One was a great pale moon, sickly and white, hanging and seeming to brood over the horizon. The other, which looked about the same size, was red and seemed to lie close at her side. It was not round, but looked blotted and blurred in the mist. Could it be a meteor? A lighthouse? Whatever it was the cause of the commotion which had been so intense, and which now seemed to be already subsiding. I had heard the men called up not 3 minutes before, and now 2 boats were already lowered, and Tom was in command of the foremost. I heard his voice coming from the water. And no one prevented me now from rushing to the side to look over, turning my back on the moon and her lurid companion. Though the night was not dark, I could not discern the boats, and after straining my eyes into the mist, I observed that it was rapidly melting away, and rolling on as well as rolling together, so that spaces of water here and there were clear, and moonlight glittered on them. The binnacle light glared in my uncle's face as he stooped over it. I heard Brand whisper to his wife that he had taken charge of the yacht, and I did not dare to speak to him, though what it might be that alarmed them I could not tell. It was, as it seemed, but a moment that I had stared out into the mist, looking for the boats with still sleepy eyes. Then, as the sailors that were left tramped back to the forepart of the yacht, I turned again. The mist had shaken itself and rolled on before a light air that was coming. I saw 2 great pathways now lying along the waters. One was silver white, the pathway of the wan moon. The other was blood red and angry, and a burning vessel lay at her head. Oh, what a sight! Can I ever forget it? The fire was spurting from every crevice of the black hull. Her great mainmast was gone. The mizzenmast lay with several great white sails surging about in the water, and she was dragging it along with her. The foremast only stood, and its rigging and sails had not yet caught. A dead silence had succeeded now to the commotion in the vessel. Men were standing stock still, perhaps waiting for their orders, and my uncle's were the only eyes that were not strained to follow the leaping and dazzling spires. Every moment we approached. Now the first waft of the smoke came in our faces. Now we could hear the crackling and rending, the creak and shiver, and the peculiar roaring noise made by the mastering fire. "A full-rigged ship," I heard Brand whisper to his wife. 1100 tons at the least." "Merciful heaven!" she whispered in reply. "I hope she won't blow up. Anyhow, I thank the Lord we've got master in command himself." I never saw anything like the horrible beauty of that red light. It added tenfold to the terror of the scene to see her coming on so majestically, dragging with her broken spars and great yards and sprawling sails. She looked like some splendid live creature in distress, and rocked now a good deal in the water, for every moment the wind seemed to rise, bringing up a long swell with it. The moon went down, and in a few minutes the majestic ship supplied all the light to the dark sky and black water. I saw the 2 little dark boats nearing her, knew that my brother was in the foremost, and shook with fear, and cried to God to take care of him. But while I and all gazed in awful silence on the sailing ship, the flames, bursting through the deck in a new place, climbed up the fore-rigging, and in one single leap, as if they had been living things, they were licking the sails off the ropes, and, shooting higher than her topsails, they spread themselves out like quivering fans. I saw every sail that was left in an instant bathed in flames. A second burst came raging up from below, blackening and shrivelling everything before it. Then I saw the weltering fire run down again, and still the wreck, plunging her bows in the water, came rocking on and on. "How near does our old man mean to go?" whispered Mrs. Brant, and almost at that instant I observed that he had given some order to the man at the helm, and I could distinctly hear a murmur of satisfaction. Then almost directly a cry of horror rose. We were very near her, and while the water hissed with strange distinctness, and steamed in her wake, her blazing foremast fell over the side, plunging with a tremendous crash into the sea, sending up dangerous showers of sparks and burning bits of sailcloth, and covering our decks with falling tinder. The black water took in and quenched all that blazing top hamper, and still the awful hissing was audible, till suddenly, as we seemed to be sheering off from her, there was a thunderous roll that sounded like the breaking of her mighty heart, and still glorious in beauty she plunged head foremost and went down blazing into the desolate sea. In one instant that raging glow and all the fierce illumination of the fire were gone. Darkness had settled on the face of the deep. I saw a few lighted spars floating about, that was all, and I smelt the fire, and felt the hot smoke rushing past my face, as the only evidence that this was not a dream. Oh, the misery of the next half hour! The boats, when that ill-fated ship went down, must, I knew, have been very near her. Had they been sucked in? Had they been overturned? Or had they been so blessed as to be saved, and to save some of the wretched passengers and crew? Of all persons in the yacht, then, perhaps I suffered most. I was the most ignorant. I had no one to speak to, for Mrs. Brand, perhaps lest I should question her, had retreated, and I could not think of addressing my uncle. He had plenty on his mind and on his hands. I could only observe the activity of others by the light of the many lanterns which were now hung out from various parts of the rigging, and hope that we should soon find the boats, though every light hung up seemed to increase the darkness, and make us more unable to see anything beyond the bounds of the yacht. At last, Brand standing near me again, I said, "Oh, Brand, cannot we go nearer the place where that ship sunk? Perhaps some poor creatures may be floating on the waters still." "Ma'am," he replied, "we are sailing now as nigh as may be over the very spot where she went down. But you have no call to be frightened. Everything has been done that can be done. We hove to directly we sighted her." "Yes," I said, "but what good could that do?" "Why, ma'am," he replied, "we could not have lowered the boats without that, and then, you know, when they were off, we filled, and stood in as nigh as we dared." "Then where are the boats?" I inquired. "God knows, ma'am." "And what are these lights for? Every one you put up makes it harder to see anything. How are we to find them?" "We have no call to find them," he replied. "We want them to find us. Most likely there are other boats about, besides our own, boats from the ship. We want to make ourselves as conspicuous as we can. At least, I reckon that is why master has ordered all these lights out." "And why cannot we pick up any of the poor creatures that may have been on board? Surely we could have heard their cries, and could now. We are not half a quarter of a mile from her." "No, ma'am, nothing like that distance, not half that distance. That's why our people think she must have been deserted." The steward passed on, and I covered my face with my hands and moaned in the misery of my heart. Oh, my only brother! Had I really lost him so? I listened. The silence about me was so intense that I knew there was much anxiety felt. Every face, as it passed under a lantern, had a restless and yet awestruck look. My uncle's, when he bent over the illuminated compass, did not at all reassure me. But such a misfortune as I had dreaded, such a terrible blow, we were to be spared. I got up again, gazed out over the dark water, and longed for the dawn. Something better than dawn was destined to meet my eyes. Between us and a spar that still glowed, two dark objects stood suddenly, a boat and black figures and moving oars, another behind her. I shall never forget with what a thrill of joy I heard our people cheer. In 10 minutes we could hear the stroke of their oars, and directly after Tom was on deck and his crew with him. "God bless you," said my uncle to Tom. "Anybody saved?" "One," said Tom. "Only one, sir." End of Story 12. Biographical Notes. Jean Ingelow was an English poetess and novelist, born in 1820. She died in 1899. Her chief novels are Off the Skelligs, Fated to be Free, Don John, and Sarah de Berenger. The High Tide on the Coast of Lincolnshire and A Story of Doom are the best known of her poetical writings.
Story 13 of the Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. Sea Stories edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 13. In the Gulf Stream, from At Last by Charles Kingsley. The appearance of the first fragments of gulfweed caused quite a little excitement, and set an enthusiastic pair of naturalists, a Midland hunting squire and a travelled scientific doctor who had been 12 years in the eastern archipelago, fishing eagerly over the bows with an extemporized grapple of wire for gulfweed, a specimen of which they did not catch. However, more and more still would come in a day or two, perhaps whole acres, even whole leagues, and then, so we hoped, but hoped in vain, we should have our feast of zoophytes, crustacea, and what not. Meanwhile, it must be remembered that this gulfweed has not, as some of the uninitiated fancy from its name, anything to do with the Gulf Stream, along the southern edge of which we were streaming. Thrust away to the south by that great ocean river, it lies in a vast eddy or central pool of the Atlantic, between the Gulf Stream and the equatorial current, unmoved save by surface drifts of wind, as floating weeds collect and range slowly round and round in the still corners of a tumbling bay or salmon pool. One glance at a bit of the weed, as it floats past, showed that it was like no fucus of our shores or anything we ever saw before. The difference of look is undefinable in words, but clear enough. One sees in a moment that the sargassos, of which there are several species on tropical shores, are a genus of themselves and by themselves, and a certain awe may, if the beholder be at once scientific and poetical, come over him at the first sight of this famous and unique variety thereof, which has lost ages since the habit of growing on rock or sea bottom, but propagates itself forever floating, and feeds among its branches a whole family of fish, crabs, cuttlefish, zoophytes, mollusks, which, like the plant which shelters them, are found nowhere else in the world. And that awe, springing from the scientific use of the imagination, would be increased if he recollected the theory, not altogether impossible, that this sargasso, and possibly some of the animals which cling to it, marks the site of an Atlantic continent, sunk long ages since, and that transformed by the necessities of life from a rooting to a floating plant. Still it remembers its august abodes, and wanders round and round as if in search of the rocks where once it grew. We looked eagerly day by day for more and more gulfweed, hoping that slimy things would crawl with legs upon that slimy sea. and thought of the memorable day when Columbus's ship first plunged her bows into the tangled ocean meadow, and the sailors, naturally enough, were ready to mutiny, fearing hidden shoals, ignorant that they had 4 miles of blue water beneath their keel, and half recollecting old Greek and Phoenician legends of a weedy sea off the coast of Africa, where the vegetation stopped the ships and kept them entangled till all on board were starved. Day after day we passed more and more of it, often in long processions, ranged in the direction of the wind, while, a few feet below the surface, here and there floated large fronds of lettuce-like weed, seemingly an ulva, the bright green of which, as well as the red-orange of the sargasso, brought out by the contrast of the intense blue of the water. Very remarkable, meanwhile, and unexpected was the opacity and seeming solidity of this ocean which looked down on from the bows, whether sapphire under the sunlight, or all but black under the clouds, or laced and streaked with beads of foam rising out of the nether darkness. It looked as though it could resist the hand, as if one might almost walk on it, so unlike any liquid as seen near shore or inland is this leaping, heaving plain, reminding one, by its innumerable conchoidal curves, not of water, not even of ice, but rather of obsidian. After all, we got little of the sargasso. Only in a sailing ship and in calms or light breezes can its treasures be explored. 12 knots an hour is a pace sufficient to tear off the weed, as it is hauled alongside, all living things which are not rooted to it. We got, therefore, no crustacea, neither did we get a single specimen of the calamaries, which may be described as cuttlefish carrying hooks on their arms as well as suckers, the lingering descendants of a most ancient form, which existed as far back as the era of the shallow oolitic seas, X or Y thousand years ago. A tiny curled sporobus, a Lipararia with its thousandfold cells, and a tiny polyp belonging to the Campanularius, with a creeping stem, which sends up here and there a yellow-stalked bell, were all the parasites we saw. But the sargasso itself is a curious instance of the fashion in which one form so often mimics another of a quite different family. When fresh out of the water, it resembles not a seaweed so much as a sprig of some willow-leafed shrub, burdened with yellow berries, large and small, for every broken bit of it seems growing and throwing out ever new berries and leaves, or what, for want of a better word, must be called leaves in a seaweed. For it must be remembered that the frond of a seaweed is not merely leaf, but root also, that it not only breathes air, but feeds on water, and that even the so-called root by which the seaweed holds to the rock is really only an anchor, holding mechanically to the stone, but not deriving, as the root of a land plant would, any nourishment from it. Therefore it is, that to grow while uprooted and floating, though impossible to most land plants, is easy enough to many seaweeds, and especially to the sargasso. The flying fish now began to be a source of continual amusement, as they scuttled away from under the bows of the ship, mistaking her, probably, for some huge devouring whale. So strange are they when first seen, though long read of and looked for, that it is difficult to recollect that they are actually fish. The first little one was mistaken for a dragonfly, the first big one for a grey plover. The flight is almost exactly like that of a quail or partridge flight, I must say, for in spite of all that has been learnedly written to the contrary, It was too difficult as yet for the English sportsmen on board to believe that their motion was not a true flight, aided by the vibration of the wings, and not a mere impulse given, as in the leap of a salmon, by a rush under water. That they can change their course at will is plain to one who looks down on them from the lofty deck, and still more from the paddle box. The length of the flight seems too great to be attributed to a few strokes of the tail, while the plain fact that they renew their flight after touching, and only touching, the surface would seem to show that it was not due only to the original impetus, for that would be retarded, instead of being quickened, every time they touched. Such were our first impressions, and they were confirmed by what we saw on the voyage home. The nights as yet, we will not say disappointed us, for to see new stars like Canopus and Fomalhaut shining in the far south, even to see Sirius, in his ever-changing blaze of red and blue, riding high in a December heaven, is interesting enough. But the brilliance of the stars is not, at least at this season, equal to that of the frosty sky in England. Nevertheless, to make up for the deficiency, the clouds were glorious, so glorious that I longed again and again, as I did afterwards in the West Indies, that Mr. Ruskin were by my side to see and to describe as none but he can do. The evening skies are fit weeds for widowed Eos weeping over the dying sun, thin, formless, rent, in carelessness, not in rage, and of all the hues of early autumn leaves, purple and brown, with green and primrose lakes of air between. But all hues weakened, mingled, chastened into loneliness, tenderness, regretfulness, through which still shines, in endless vistas of clear western light, the hope of the returning day. More and more faint, the pageant fades below towards the white haze of the horizon, where in sharpest contrast leaps and welters against it the black jagged sea, and richer it grows upward till it cuts the azure overhead, until only too soon the sun's rim dips, the stars rush out. At one stride comes the dark, to be succeeded, after long balmy nights, by a sunrise which repeats the colors of the sunset, but this time gaudy, dazzling, triumphant, as befits the season of faith and hope. Such imagery, it may be said, is hackneyed now, and trite even to impertinence. It may be so at home, but here, in presence of the magnificent pageant of tropic sunlight, it is natural, almost inevitable, and the old myth of the daily birth and death of Helios, and the bridal joys and widowed tears of Eos, reinvents itself in the human mind as soon as it asserts its power. It may be its sacred right to translate nature into the language of the feelings. End of story 13. Biographical notes. Kingsley, Charles, an English clergyman and author, born in Devonshire, 1819, died 1875. From 1844 until his death, he was rector of Eversley in Hampshire. In 1873, he was appointed Canon of Westminster and chaplain to Queen Victoria. He wrote Alton Locke and Yeast, 2 years ago, Hereward the Wake, Hypatia, and Westward Ho, and under the pen name of Parson Lot wrote much on Christian socialism, a charming book of travel, At Last, and the Heroes, Glaucus, and the Water Babies, Prose Ideals, Health and Education, are some of his other books. His life, by his widow, is the most interesting biography. Story 14 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. Sea Stories edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 14. The Loss of the Royal George. From The Child of the Wreck by W.H.G. Kingston. I am not likely to forget that next morning, the 28th of August, 1789. It was a fine summer's morning, and there was just a little sea on, with a strongest breeze blowing from the eastward, but not enough to prevent boats coming off from Portsmouth. I counted 40 sail of the line, a dozen frigates and smaller ships of war, and well nigh 300 merchant vessels, riding, as of course we were, to the flood with our heads towards Cowes. You will understand that under the lower deck was fitted a cistern, into which the sea water was received, then pumped up by a hand pump, fixed in the middle of the gun deck, for the purpose of washing the two lower gun decks. The water was let into this cistern by a pipe which passed through the ship's side, and which was secured by a stopcock on the inside. It had been found the morning before that this watercock, which was about 3 feet below the waterline, was out of order and must be repaired. The foreman came off from the dockyard and said that it was necessary to careen the ship over to port, sufficiently to raise the mouth of the pipe which went through the ship's timbers below, clean out the water, that he and his men might work at it. Between 7 and 8 o'clock the order was given to run the larboard guns out as far as they could go, the larboard ports being opened. The starboard guns were also run in amidships and secured by tackles, the moving over of this great weight of metal bringing the larboard lower deck port sills just level with the water. The men were then able to get at the mouth of the pipe. For an hour the ship remained in this position, while carpenters were at work. We had been taking in rum and shot on the previous day, and now a sloop called the Lark, which belonged to the three brothers, came alongside with the last cargo of rum. She having been secured to the larboard side, the hands were piped to clear the lighter. I had been on duty on the main deck. Several ladies had come off early in the morning, friends and relations of the officers. Some of them were either in the wardroom or gunroom, and others were walking the quarter-deck with the help of their gentlemen friends, as it was no easy matter, the ship heeling over as much as she was then doing. They thought it very good fun, however, and were laughing and talking as they tried to keep their feet from slipping. I had been sent with a message to Mr. Hollingbury, our third lieutenant, who was officer of the watch. He seemed out of temper, and gave me a rough answer, as he generally did. He was not a favourite, indeed, with us, and we used to call him Jib and Foresail Jack, for when he had the watch at night, he was always singing out, "Up jib and down jib, up foresail, down foresail," and from a habit he had of moving his fingers about when walking the quarter-deck, we used to say that he had been an organ player in London. Just as I got back to the main deck, I caught a glimpse of a young lady in black, leading a little boy. She turned her face towards me, and I saw that she was the very same who had come to my wife's cottage the previous evening. Indeed, I should have known her by the little boy by her side. I had to return to the quarter-deck again, and when I once more came back to the main deck, I could nowhere see her, but whether she went into the wardroom or had gone below, I could not learn. I asked several people, for I thought she might have brought me off a message from Susan, and I might, I fancied, have been of use to her in finding the person she wished to see. While I was looking about, Mr. Webb, the purser's clerk, who had received orders to go on shore in charge of a boat, came up and ordered me to call the crew away. A couple of midshipmen were going with him. This took up some time, and prevented me from finding the young lady. Just then, as I went up to report the boat gone to Mr. Hollingbury, Mr. Williams, the carpenter, came up from the lower deck and requested that he would be pleased to order the ship to be righted, as she was heeling over more than she could bear. The lieutenant gave one of his usual short answers to the carpenter, who went below, looking as though he did not at all like it. He was back again, however, before I had left the deck, when he said in a short, quick way, as if there were not a moment to lose, "If you please, sir, the ship is getting past her bearings. It's my duty to tell you she will no longer bear it." "If you think, sir, you can manage the ship better than I can, you had better take the command," answered Mr. Hollingbury, in an angry tone, twitching his fingers and turning away. About this time there were a good many men in the waist who heard what the carpenter had said, and what answer the lieutenant gave. They all knew, as I did, that the ship must be in great danger, or the carpenter would not have spoken so sharply as he had. A large number of the crew, however, were below, some on board the lighter, others at the yard tackles and stayfalls, hoisting in casks. Some in the spirit room stowing away, others bearing the casks down the hatchway, all busy clearing the lighter. The greater number, it will be understood, were on the larboard side, and that brought the ship down more to larboard. There was a little more sea on than before, which had begun to wash into the lower deck ports, and having no escape, there was soon a great weight of water on the lower deck. Several of the men, not dreaming of danger, were amusing themselves, laughing and shouting, catching mice, for there were a good many of them in the ship, which the water had driven out of their quarters. It's my belief, however, that the casks of rum hoisted in, and lying on the larboard side, before they could be lowered into the hold, helped very much to bring the ship down. There stood the lieutenant, fuming at the way the carpenter had spoken to him. Suddenly, however, it seemed to occur to him that the carpenter was right, and he ordered the drummer to beat to quarters, that the guns may be run into their places and the ship righted. Dictator was shouted quick enough along the deck, for everyone now saw that not a moment was to be lost, as the ship had just then heeled over still more. The moment the drummer was called, all hands began tumbling down the hatchways to their quarters, that they might run in their guns. Just then I saw the young midshipman whom I had observed going off with Mr. Webb, standing at the entrance port singing out for the boat. He had forgotten his dirk, he said, and had come back to fetch it. The boat, however, had gone some distance off, and he was left behind. Poor fellow, it was a fatal piece of forgetfulness for him. "Never mind, Jimmy Fish," said little Crispo, one of the smallest midshipmen I ever saw, for he was only 9 years old. "There is another boat going ashore directly, and you can go in her." He gave an angry answer, and went back into the gun-room, swearing at his ill luck. The men had just got hold of the gun tackles, and were about to hoist out their guns, which had been run in amidships, some 500 of them or more having for the purpose gone over to the larboard side, which caused the ship to heel over still more, when the water made a rush into the larboard lower deck ports, and, do all they could, the guns ran in again upon them. Feeling sure that the ship could not be righted, I, seizing little Crispo, made a rush to starboard, and dashing through an open port found myself outside the ship, which at that moment went completely over, her masts and spars sinking under the water. Somehow or other the young midshipman broke from me and slipped over into the sea. I thought the poor little fellow would have been lost, but he struck out bravely, which was, as it turned out, the best thing he could have done, as he could swim quite well. I had just before seen all the portholes crowded with seamen trying to escape, and jamming one another so that they could scarcely move one way or the other. The ship now lying down completely on her larboard broadside. Suddenly the heads of most of the men disappeared, they having dropped back into the ship, many of those who were holding on being hauled down by others below them. It was, you see, as if they had been trying to get out of a number of chimneys, with nothing for their feet to rest upon. Directly afterwards there came such a rush of wind through the ports that my hat was blown off. It was the air from the hold, which, having no other vent, escaped as the water pouring in took up its space. The whole side of the ship was, I said, covered with seamen and marines, and here and there a Jew maybe, and a good many women and a few children shrieking and crying out for mercy. Never have I heard such a fearful wailing. One poor woman near me shrieked out for her husband, but he was nowhere to be seen, and she thought he was below with those who by this time were drowned. For there were hundreds who had been on the lower decks and in the hold, who had never even reached the ports, and some who had fallen back into the sea as it rushed in at the larboard side. She implored me to help her, and I said I would if I could. We could see boats putting off from the ships all round to our help, and here and there people swimming for their lives who had leaped from the stern ports, or had been on the upper deck. I could not help thinking of our fine old admiral, and wished that he might be among them, but he was not, for he was writing in his cabin at the time, and when the captain tried to let him know that the ship was sinking, he found the door so jammed by her heeling over that he could not open it, and was obliged to rush aft and make his escape through a stern port to save his life. This I afterwards heard. The ship went completely over. As the ship had floated for some minutes, I began to hope that she would continue in the same position, and that I and others around me on her side might be saved. I hoped this for my own sake, and still more for that of my dear wife. I had been thinking of her all the time, for I knew that it would go well nigh to break her heart if I was taken from her, as it were, just before her eyes. Suddenly I found to my horror that the ship was settling down. The shrieks of despair which rent the air on every side, not only from women, but from many a man I had looked upon as a stout fellow, rang in my ears. Knowing that if I went down with the ship I should have a hard job to rise again, I seized the poor woman by her dress and leaped off with her into the sea. But to my horror her dress tore, and before I could get hold of her again she was swept from me. I had struck out for some distance when I felt myself as it were drawn back, and, on looking round, I saw the ship's upper works disappear beneath the waters, which were covered with a mass of human beings, shrieking and lifting up their hands in despair. Presently they all disappeared. Just then I felt myself drawn down by someone getting hold of my foot under the water, but managing to kick off my shoe, I quickly rose again and struck out away from the spot, impelled by instinct rather than anything else, for I had no time for thought. Then directly afterwards up came the mass, almost with a bound, as it were, and stood out of the water, with a slight list only to starboard, with the fore, main, and mizzen tops all above water, as well as part of the bowsprit and ensign staff, with the flag still hoisted to it. Many people were floating about, making for the tops and riggings, several of them terror-stricken, who could not swim, catching hold of those that could, I thought, on seeing this that it would be wiser to keep clear of them till I could reach a boat coming towards the wreck at no great distance off. I was pretty nigh exhausted when I reached the boat, in which were a waterman and two young gentlemen, who happened to be crossing from Ryde to Portsmouth at the time. They soon hauled me in, and I begged them to pull on and save some of the drowning people. As neither of them could row, quickly recovering, I took one of the oars and was about to sit down to help the waterman, when I saw not far off several sheep, pigs, and fowls swimming in all directions, while hen coops and all sorts of articles were floating about. Out of nearly 1,000 souls who had been alive and well on board the ship in the morning, between 700 and 800 were now lifeless, besides our gallant admiral, who had been drowned while sitting writing in his cabin. 3 of the lieutenants, including the one whose obstinacy had produced the disaster, the larger number of the midshipmen, the sergeant, master, and the major, and several other officers of the marines, were drowned, as were some ladies who had just before come on board. 60 of the marines had gone on shore in the morning. A considerable number of the rest, who were on the upper deck, were saved, but the greater number of the crew, many of whom were in the hold stowing away the rum casks, had perished. Indeed, out of the ship's whole complement, 70 seamen only escaped with their lives. I was sorry to hear that Mr. Williams, the carpenter, whose advice, had it been followed, would have saved the ship, was drowned. His body was picked up directly afterwards and carried on board the Victory, where it was laid on the hearth before the galley fire, in the hopes that he might recover, but life was extinct. Captain Waghorn, though he could not swim, was saved. After trying to warn the admiral, he rushed across the deck and leaped into the sea, calling on others to follow his example. A young gentleman, Mr. Pierce, was near him. "Can you swim?" he asked. "No," was the answer. "Then you must try, my lad," he said, and hurled him into the water. 2 men, fortunately good swimmers, followed. One of them, getting hold of the captain, supported him, and swam away from the ship. The other fell upon Mr. Pierce, of whom he got hold and supported above water till the ship settled, when he placed him on the main top, and both were saved. The captain, in the meantime, was struggling in the water, and was with great difficulty kept afloat. A boat with our 7th lieutenant, Mr. Philip Durham, had on the very instant the ship went over come alongside, when she was drawn down, and all in her were thrown into the water. Mr. Durham had just time to throw off his coat before the ship sank and left him floating among men and hammocks. A drowning marine caught hold of his waistcoat and drew him several times under water. Finding that he could not free himself, and that both would be drowned, he threw his legs round a hammock, and unbuttoning his waistcoat with one hand, he allowed it to be drawn off, and then swam for the main shrouds, where there he caught sight of the captain struggling in the water, and a boat coming to take him off. He refused assistance till Captain Waghorn and the seamen supporting him were received on board. The captain's son, poor lad, who had been below, lost his life. I heard that the body of the marine was washed on shore 10 days afterwards, with the lieutenant's waistcoat round his arm, and a pencil case, having his initials on it, found safe in the pocket. There was only one woman saved out of the 300 on board, and I believe she was the one I had helped out of the port. Her name was Horn, and I was glad to find that her husband was also saved. It was curious that the youngest midshipman, Mr. Crispo, and probably one of the smallest children, our little chap, should have been saved, while so many strong men were drowned. Our first lieutenant, Mr. Saunders, who had been busy in the wings, was drowned. His body, with his gold watch and some money in his pocket, was picked up, floating under the stern of the Indiaman off the Mother Bank. Of the three brothers who owned the sloop, two perished and one was saved. It was owing to her being lashed alongside that the ship righted, or she would have probably remained on her side. I was a good swimmer myself, and had I not been, I should have lost my life long ago. I have often thought what a pity it is that all seamen do not learn to swim. Many more might have been saved, but those who could not swim got hold of the men who could, and both were drowned together. If all had struck out from the ship when they found her going over, a greater number would have been picked up. Instead of that, afraid to trust themselves in the water, they stuck by her, and they and the large number who got into the launch were drawn down with the ship, and all perished. The foreman of the plumbers, whose boat was lashed head and stern, was, with all his men, drawn into the vortex as the ship went down, and not one of them escaped. It was a sad sight, 10 days or a fortnight afterwards, to see the bodies which were picked up. Some were buried in Kingston churchyard near Portsmouth, and a large number in an open spot to the east of Ryde. Some time afterward a monument was put up in Kingston churchyard to the memory of the brave Admiral Kempenfeldt and his ship's company. A court of inquiry was held, when Captain Waghorn was honourably acquitted, and it came out that in so rotten a state was the side of the ship that some large portions of her frame must have given way, and it is only a wonder that she did not go down before. When I come to think that she had upwards of 1,000 tons of dead weight and spirits on board, it is surprising that she should have held together. An attempt was made soon afterwards to raise the Royal George, and very nearly succeeded, as she was lifted up and moored some way from the spot where she went down. But a heavy gale coming on, some of the lighters sank, and the gear gave way, and she was again lost. It was whispered that on account of her rotten state the Admiralty had no wish to have her afloat, but that might have been scandal. End of story 14. Biographical notes. Kingston, W.H.G. English writer of boys' stories, born 1814, died 1880. His father was a merchant in Oporto, and his voyages thence to London gave him his knowledge of ships and sailing. His first books for boys, Peter the Whaler, had an immense success. Among his most popular books are The Three Midshipmen, The Three Lieutenants, and The Three Admirals. He wrote over 120 books of this kind, all simple, vigorous, and healthy in tone.
Story 15 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn. Sea Stories. Edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 15. Sailor's Yarns. From Jean Berny, Sailor. By Pierre Loti. Within the tropics, on a wondrous evening when the southern trades were blowing with their balmiest softness, the corporeal portion of his being tired with a healthy muscular fatigue, gently lulled by the slumberous rhythmic motion of the ship, as a little child is rocked to sleep in his cradle, Jean was half sitting, half lying on the deck in the mild light of the new-born stars, in the midst of the gathering swarm of white-jacketed sailor lads, who were coming up from below, one after another, and forming snug little groups, preparatory to passing the pleasant hours of evening in one another's society. And in those moments of calmness and repose that precede slumber, his thoughts, as usual, assumed a more sombre cast, as the future and that dreaded examination rose before his mind. Close at hand on his right were his two chosen comrades, Le Marec, quartermaster, and Joal, captain of the mizentop, both hailing from the Côte du Nord, surrounded at that moment by a group of young pays, or men from their own district, who were listening reverentially to their conversation. On his left was a little congregation of Basques, a race apart, who every now and then would break out and chatter in an unintelligible jargon older than the hills. A little further away another group was singing in chorus a lively air in couplets, in which the refrain "Old Neptune, monarch of the sea," came in every minute or so in a light, catchy way. Among the Bretons, a blood-curdling, marrow-freezing story of mystery and darkness was going on, the confused beginning of which Jean had failed to catch. The yarn was of a suspicious-looking brig, derelict and abandoned by her crew, that had been encountered in the English Channel in the twilight at the close of a dim winter's day, a ghostly wanderer on the water that no one dared board for fear of encountering dead men on her. The Basques of the group to the left were listening to a wild tale of warlike adventure beneath a blazing sun and on the burning sands of Dahomey. The two stories, equally lurid and fantastic, reached Jean's ears in disconnected fragments, and were mingled and blended in his brain, over which sleep was beginning to exert its confusing influence, while from the chorus in the distance came the persistently reiterated refrain of "Old Neptune," running thread-like through the whole, and connecting the parts by a sort of obbligato accompaniment. There is small opportunity for privacy on shipboard of a fine evening, when the crew are all on deck. "Well," Le Marec was saying, he had been a fisherman of Brieuk in his younger days, "well, at last we concluded to board her." It was of that gruesome derelict that he was speaking. It was none too light, for the weather was thick, and the night was close at hand, and I tell you what it is, boys, I felt pretty shaky about that time. All the same, though, I raise my hands and catch onto the gunwale, so as to hoist myself up, and get a look at what was inside, and then, my friends, what think you it is I see? A huge tall form with black face and horns, and a long pointed beard that springs to its feet and makes a rush for me. "It was the devil, wasn't it?" asked Joal, convinced that he had guessed aright. "We thought it was for certain for a while, but no, it was only an old billy-goat. But such a great big fellow you can't imagine. I don't believe anyone ever saw his like." And Turobeta, a Basque from Zitzari, was running on at the same time, in a voice that, compared with the deep tones of the honest Bretons, seemed shrill and piercing as a fife. It was the Amazon who had informed on the poor beggar of a spy, don't you see? Then the other fellow, the big black man, catches hold of him. "Come along to the beach," he says to him. Come along, I am going to chop off your head." "And did he go?" inquired the sceptical Etcheverry, who was from Biarritz, where the sailors are beginning to acquire more modern ideas. "Did he go? Of course he did, because he couldn't help himself, don't you see? The moment he was caught playing the spy, he knew it was all up with him. He didn't feel any too good over it, all the same, as you may suppose." And the Breton continued to reel off his yarn of mystery and darkness. The billy-goat was the only living soul on board the brig, and as she was carrying a cargo of barley in bulk, he had had plenty to eat. If I were to try to tell you how fat he was, you wouldn't believe me. So he goes to work and binds the dirty spy's hand behind his back, Turabeta continued. That way, with a rope of straw, such as they used to fasten their horses with in that beastly country, and makes him get down on his knees upon the sand, and begins to hack away at the back of his neck with his old cheese toaster. But now that it was fairly begun, the other fellow didn't want any more of it. Oh, boys, you ought to have heard the fuss he made, and the Amazon grinned and showed her white teeth. See, like that, to show how glad she was, I suppose. Well, you may believe me or not, just as you choose, but his regulation sabre was so dull that he could not do the job with it, and in order to finish the business he had to go down into his pocket and bring out a cheap little knife that I myself had given him, and for which I paid old Mother Virginie in the bazaar at Goree 10 sous when it was new. While the listeners were making merry over this original method of executing a death sentence, their neighbors, the Bretons, were brooding reflectively over the history of the abandoned brig and the black goat, and Jean, who, toward the conclusion of the two narratives, had bent his ear alternately to left and right to listen, smiled indulgently at the childish credulity of his shipmates. The sprightly song Old Neptune also inspired him with some of its irresistible, contagious gaiety. He had never felt himself so completely and thoroughly a sailor as he did that evening. His anxieties for the future, which had been growing less troublesome with each succeeding day, now vanished entirely in the sensation of well-being and repose experienced by his weary body. He yielded himself up to the purely animal delight of living and breathing, on that pleasant evening, of feeling his muscles so hard and supple under his loosely fitting garments. He stretched himself at full length on the snow-white planks, which were his most frequent bed, and made a pillow of the man who chanced to be next to him, a neighbourly courtesy to which no sailorman objects. It was of all the 24 the enchanting hour on those summer seas, where the gentle trade winds blow. For a moment he was conscious of the tall edifice of snowy canvas towering above his head and oscillating with irregular rhythmic movement upon the deep blue of the heavens. Then the bright constellations of the southern sky blazed forth between the sails and rigging, now growing more shadowy and indistinct, and seemed to be playing a solemn game of hide-and-seek, vanishing at uniform intervals, and reappearing, then hiding again, to commence afresh their stately evolutions in unison with the easy rolling of the vessel. At last they faded from his sight, and beneficent slumber, bearer of oblivion and peace, descended and sealed his eyes. End of story 15. Biographical notes. Loti, Pierre, French marine officer and author, born in 1850. He entered the Navy in 1867 and at first sailed the Pacific Ocean. He went through the Chinese campaign with distinction. Among his numerous books may be cited Asiade, Le Mariage de Loti, The Romance of a Spahi, The Iceland Fisherman, Madame Chrysanthemum, The Romance of a Child, The Book of Pity and of Death, and A Phantom of the East.
Story 16 of the Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. Sea Stories edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 16. Mr. Midshipman Easy. Jack Easy, the hero of Captain Marryat's story, was no fool, but a bit of a philosopher. He had been spoiled by an indulgent mother and a foolish father, who was continually prosing about equality and the rights of man. Indeed, Jack could even out-talk his father upon this subject. There was no end to Jack's arguing the point, though there seldom was a point to his argument. At 16 he resolved to leave school and go to sea, and though Mr. Easy was unwilling, Jack insisted on his rights as his father's equal, and the old man yielded. He was to sail as midshipman on the sloop of war Harpy, with Captain Wilson, a relative of his father's. He set out for Portsmouth with plenty of money in his pockets, and squandering this, he loitered 3 weeks in the town without reporting to his ship. When Captain Wilson heard of this, he sent Mr. Sawbridge, his lieutenant, to summons the boy. Mr. Sawbridge peremptorily ordered Jack on board, but the officer was not in uniform, and Jack did not understand naval etiquette. He pertly refused to go until he should be ready, arguing his equality with any officer. Lieutenant Sawbridge departed, threatening that if Jack did not appear that night, a file of Marines should arrest him in the morning. He reported Jack's disobedience to the captain, but the latter, hoping to undo the father's foolish lessons, resolved to discipline the boy gradually and gently. He sent a note inviting him to breakfast at 9 on the following morning, which invitation Jack politely accepted. The next few pages gives Jack's first experience of equality at sea. Equality at Sea, from Mr. Midshipman Easy, by Captain Frederick, Marryat. The next morning Jack Easy would have forgotten all about his engagement with the captain, had it not been for the waiter, who thought that after the reception which our hero had given the first lieutenant, it would be just as well that he should not be disrespectful to the captain. Now Jack had not hitherto put on his uniform, and he thought this a fitting occasion, particularly as the waiter suggested the propriety of his appearance in it. Whether it was from a presentiment of what he was to suffer, Jack was not at all pleased, as most lads are, with the change in his dress. It appeared to him that he was sacrificing his independence. However, he did not follow his first impulse, which was to take it off again, but took his hat, which the waiter had brushed and handed to him, then set off for the captain's lodgings. Captain Wilson received him as if he had not been aware of his delay in joining his ship, or his interview with his first lieutenant. But before breakfast was over, Jack himself narrated the affair in a few words. Captain Wilson then entered into a detail of duties and rank of every person on board of the ship, pointing out to Jack that where discipline was required it was impossible, when duty was carried on, that more than one could command, and that one was the captain, who represented the king in person, who represented the country, and that, as the orders were transmitted from the captain through the lieutenant, and from the lieutenant to the midshipmen, who in their turn communicated them to the whole ship's company. In fact, it was the captain alone who gave the orders, and that every one was equally obliged to obey. Indeed, as the captain himself had to obey the orders of his superiors, the admiral and the admiralty, all on board might be said to be equally obliged to obey. Captain Wilson laid a strong emphasis on the word equally, as he cautiously administered his first dose. Indeed, in the whole of his address he made use of special pleading, which would have done credit to the bar. For at the same time that he was explaining to Jack that he was entering a service in which equality could never for a moment exist, if the service was to exist, he contrived to show that all the grades were levelled, by all being equally bound to do their duty to their country, and that, in fact, whether a seaman obeyed his orders or he obeyed the orders of his superior officer, they were in reality only obeying the orders of the country, which were administered through their channels. Jack did not altogether like this view of the subject, and the captain took care not to dwell too long upon it. He then entered upon other details which he was aware would be more agreeable to Jack. He pointed out that the Articles of War were the rules by which the service was to be guided, and that everybody, from the captain to the least boy in the ship, was equally bound to adhere to them. That a certain allowance of provisions and wine were allowed to each person on board, and this allowance was the same to all, the same to the captain as to the boy, the same in quantity as in quality, every one equally entitled to his allowance, that, although there were, of necessity, various grades necessary in the service, and the captain's orders were obliged to be passed and obeyed by all, yet still, whatever was the grade of the officer, they were equally considered as gentlemen. In short, Captain Wilson, who told the truth, and nothing but the truth, without telling the whole truth, actually made Jack fancy that he had at last found out that equality he had been seeking for in vain on shore, when at last he recollected the language used by Mr. Sawbridge the evening before, and asked the captain why that personage had so conducted himself. Now, as the language of Mr. Sawbridge was very much at variance with equality, Captain Wilson was not a little puzzled. However, he first pointed out that the first lieutenant was, at the time being, the captain, as he was the senior officer on board, as would Jack himself be if he were the senior officer on board, and that, as he before observed, the captain or senior officer represented the country, that in the Articles of War everybody who absented himself from the ship committed an error, or breach of those articles, and if any error or breach of those articles was committed by any one belonging to the ship, if the senior officer did not take notice of it, he then himself committed a breach of those articles, and was liable himself to be punished, if he could not prove that he had noticed it. It was therefore to save himself that he was obliged to point out the error, and if he did it in a strong language, it only proved his zeal for his country. "Upon my honour, then," replied Jack, "there can be no doubt about his zeal, for if the whole country had been at stake, he could not have put himself in a greater passion. Then he did his duty, but depend upon it, it was not a pleasant one to him, and I'll answer for it, when you meet him on board, he will be as friendly with you as if nothing had happened. He told me that he'd soon make me know what a first lieutenant was." "What did he mean by that?" inquired Jack. "All zeal." "Yes, but he said that as soon as he got on board, he'd show me the difference between a first lieutenant and a midshipman." "All zeal." "He said my ignorance should be a little enlightened by and by." "All zeal." "And that he'd send a sergeant and marines to fetch me." "All zeal." "That he would put my philosophy to the proof." "All zeal." "Mr. Easy, zeal will break out in this way, but we should do nothing in the service without it. Recollect that I hope and trust one day to see you also a zealous officer." Here Jack cogitated considerably, and gave no answer. "You will, I am sure," continued Captain Wilson, "find Mr. Sawbridge one of your best friends." "Perhaps so," replied Jack, "but I did not much admire our first acquaintance." "It will perhaps be your unpleasant duty to find as much fault yourself. We are all equally bound to do our duty to our country. But, Mr. Easy, I sent for you to say that we shall sail tomorrow, and, as I shall send my things off this afternoon by the launch, you had better send off yours also. At 8 o'clock I shall go on board, and we can both go in the same boat." To this Jack made no sort of objection, and having paid his bill at the fountain, he sent his chest down to the boat by some of the crew who came up for it, and attended the summons of the captain to embark. By 9 o'clock that evening Mr. Jack Easy was safe on board His Majesty's sloop Harpy. When Jack arrived on board it was dark, and he did not know what to do with himself. The captain was received by the officers on deck, who took off their hats to salute him. The captain returned the salute, and so did Jack very politely, after which the captain entered into conversation with the first lieutenant, and for a while Jack was left to himself. It was too dark to distinguish faces, and to one who had never been on board a ship too dark to move, so Jack stood where he was, which was not far from the main bitts, but he did not stay long. The boat had been hooked on to the quarter davits, and the boatswain had called out, "Set taut, me lads!" And then, with a shrill whistle, and away with her, forward came galloping and bounding along the men with the tackles. And in the dark Jack was upset, and half a dozen marines fell upon him. The men, who had no idea that an officer was floored among the others, were pleased at the joke, and continued to dance over those who were down, until they rolled themselves out of the way. Jack, who did not understand this, fared badly, and it was not until the calls piped belay that he could recover his legs, after having been trampled upon by half the starboard watch, and the breath completely jammed out of his body. Jack reeled to a carronade slide, when the officers, who had been laughing at the lark as well as the men, perceived his situation, among others Mr. Sawbridge, the first lieutenant. "Are you hurt, Mr. Easy?" said he, kindly. "A little," replied Jack, catching his breath. "You've had but a rough welcome," replied the first lieutenant, "but at certain times on board ship it is every man for himself, and God for us all. Harper," continued the first lieutenant to the doctor. "Take Mr. Easy down in the gun-room with you, and I will be down myself as soon as I can. Where is Mr. Joliffe?" "Here, sir," replied Mr. Joliffe, a master's mate, coming aft from the booms. "There's a youngster come on board with the captain. Order one of the quartermasters to get a hammock slung." In the meantime Jack went down into the gun-room, where a glass of wine somewhat recovered him. He did not stay there long, nor did he venture to talk much. As soon as his hammock was ready, Jack was glad to go to bed, and as he was much bruised he was not disturbed the next morning till past 9 o'clock. He then dressed himself, went on deck, found that the sloop was just clear of the Needles, that he felt very queer, then very sick, and was conducted by a marine down below, put into his hammock, where he remained during a gale of wind of 3 days, bewildered, confused, puzzled, and every minute knocking his head against the beams with the pitching and tossing of the sloop. "And this is going to sea," thought Jack. "No wonder that no one interferes with another here, or talks about a trespass. For I'm sure anyone is welcome to my share of the ocean, and if I once get on shore again, the devil may have my portion if he chooses." Captain Wilson and Mr. Sawbridge had both allowed Jack more leisure than most midshipmen during his illness. By the time the gale was over, the sloop was off Cape Finisterre. The next morning the sea was nearly down, and there was but a slight breeze on the waters. The comparative quiet of the night before had very much recovered our hero, and when the hammocks were piped up, he was accosted by Mr. Joliffe, the master's mate, who asked whether he intended to rouse a bit, or whether he intended to sail to Gibraltar between his blankets. Jack, who felt himself quite another person, turned out of his hammock and dressed himself. A marine had, by the captain's orders, attended Jack during his illness, and this man came to his assistance, opened his chest, and brought him all which he required, or Jack would have been in a sad dilemma. Jack then inquired where he was to go, for he had not yet been in the midshipman's berth, although 5 days on board. The marine pointed it out to him, and Jack, who felt excessively hungry, crawled over and between chests until he found himself fairly in a hole infinitely inferior to the dog kennels which received his father's pointers. "I'd not only give up the ocean," thought Jack, "and my share of it, but also my share of the harpy, unto anyone who fancies it. Equality enough here, for everyone appears equally miserably off." And he thus gave vent to his thoughts. He perceived that there was another person in the berth, Mr. Joliffe, the master's mate, who had fixed his eye upon Jack, and to whom Jack returned the compliment. The first thing that Jack observed was that Mr. Joliffe was very deeply pockmarked, and that he had but one eye, and that was a piercer. It appeared like a little ball of fire, and as if it reflected more light from the solitary candle that the candle gave. "I don't like your looks," thought Jack. "We shall never be friends." But here Jack fell into the common error of judging by appearances, as will be proved hereafter. "I'm glad to see you up again, youngster," said Joliffe. "You've been on your beams end longer than usual, but those who are strongest suffer most. You made your mind up but late to come to sea. However, they say, better late than never." "I feel very much inclined to argue the truth of that saying," replied Jack, "but it's no use just now. I'm terribly hungry. When shall we get some breakfast?" "Tomorrow morning at 8:30, replied Mr. Joliffe. "Breakfast for today has been over these 2 hours. But must I then go without?" "No, I do not say that, as we must make allowances for your illness, but it will not be breakfast." "Call it what you please," replied Jack. Only pray desire the servants to give me something to eat. Dry toast or muffins, anything will do, but I should prefer coffee. You forget that you are off Finisterre, in a midshipman's berth. Coffee we have none, muffins we never see. Dry toast cannot be made, as we have no soft bread, but a cup of tea, a ship's biscuit, and butter. I can desire the steward to get ready for you." "Well then," replied Jack, "I will thank you to procure me that." "Marine," called Joliffe, "call Mesty." "Pass the word for Mesty," cried the marine, and the two syllables were handed forward until lost in the forepart of the vessel. The person so named must be introduced to the reader. He was a curious anomaly, a black man who had been brought to America as a slave, and there sold. He was a very tall, spare-built, yet muscular form, and had a face by no means common with his race. His head was long and narrow, high cheekbones from whence his face descended down to almost a point at the chin. His nose was very small, but it was straight and almost Roman. His mouth also was unusually small, and his lips thin for an African, his teeth very white and filed to sharp points. He claimed the rank of prince in his own country, with what truth could not of course be substantiated. His master had settled at New York, and there Mesty had learned English, if it could be so called. The fact is that all the immigrant laborers at New York being Irishmen, he had learned English with the strong brogue and peculiar phraseology of the sister kingdom, dashed with a little Yankeeism. Having been told that there was no slavery in England, Mesty had concealed himself on board an English merchant vessel and escaped. On his arrival in England he had entered on board of a man of war. Having no name, it was necessary to christen him on the ship's books, and the first lieutenant, who had entered him, struck with his remarkable expression of countenance, and being a German scholar, had named him Mephistopheles Faust, from whence his Christian name had been razzied to Mesty. Mesty, in other points, was an eccentric character. At one moment, when he remembered his lineage, he was proud to excess; at others he was grave and almost sullen. But when nothing either in daily occurrences or in his mind ran contrary, he exhibited the drollery so often found in his nation, with a spice of Irish humour, as if he had caught up the latter with his Irish brogue. Mesty was soon seen coming aft, but almost double as he crouched under the beams, and taking large strides with his naked feet. "By the powers, Massa Yolliffe, but it is not seasonable at all to send for me just now. Anyhow, see how the praters are in the copper, and so many blackguard palpeens all ready to change net for net, and better themselves by the same mistake, damn 'em." "Mesty, you know I never send for you myself, or allow others to do so, unless it is necessary," replied Joliffe. "But this poor lad has eaten nothing since he's been on board, and is very hungry. You must get him a little tea." "Is it tay you mane, sir?" "I guess. To make tay, in the first place I must have water, and in the next I must have room in the galley to put the kettle on. And 'pose you want to burn the tip of your little finger just now, it's not in the galley that you find a berth for it. And then the water before 7 bells, I've a notion it's just impassable. But he must have something, Mesty." "Never mind the tea, then," replied Jack. "I'll take some milk." "Is it milk Massa manes, and the bumboat woman on the other side of the bay?" "We have no milk, Mr. Easy. You forget that we are on the blue water," replied Joliffe. "And I really am afraid that you'll have to wait till dinner time." Mesty tells the truth. "I'll tell you what, Massa Yolliffe, it's just 7 bells, and if the young gentleman would instead of tay try a little out of the copper, it might keep him aisy. It's but a little difference, tay soup and pay soup. Now a bowl of that, with some nuts and a flourish of pepper, will do him good anyhow. Perhaps the best thing he can take, Mesty. Get it as fast as you can." In a few minutes the black brought down a bowl of soup, and whole peas swimming in it, put before our hero a tin bread basket full of small biscuit, called midshipman's nuts, and the pepper castor. Jack's visions of tea, coffee, muffins, dry toast, and milk vanished as he perceived the mess, but he was very hungry, and he found it much better than he expected, and he moreover found himself much the better after he had swallowed it. It struck 7 bells, and he accompanied Mr. Joliffe on deck. When Jack Easy had gained the deck he found the sun shining gaily, a soft air blowing from the shore, and the whole of the rigging and every part of the ship loaded with the shirts, trousers, and jackets of the seamen, which had been wetted during the heavy gale, and were now hanging up to dry. All the wet sails were also spread on the booms or triced up in the riggings, and the ship was slowly forging through the blue water. The captain and the first lieutenant were standing on the gangway in conversation, and the majority of the officers were with their quadrants and sextants ascertaining the latitude at noon. The decks were white and clean. The sweepers had just laid by their brooms, and the men were busy coiling down the ropes. It was a scene of cheerfulness, activity, and order, which lightened his heart after the 4 days of suffering, close air, and confinement from which he had just emerged. The captain, who perceived him, beckoned to him, asked him kindly how he felt. The first lieutenant also smiled upon him, and many of the officers, as well as his messmates, congratulated him upon his recovery. The captain's steward came up to him, touched his hat, and requested the pleasure of his company to dinner in the cabin. Jack was the essence of politeness, took off his hat, and accepted the invitation. Jack was standing on a rope which a seaman was coiling down. The man touched his hat, and requested he be so kind as to take his foot off. Jack took his hat off his head in return, and his foot off the rope. The master touched his hat and reported 12 o'clock to the first lieutenant. The first lieutenant touched his hat and reported 12 o'clock to the captain. The captain touched his hat and told the first lieutenant to make it so. The officer of the watch touched his hat and asked the captain whether they should pipe to dinner. The captain touched his hat and said, "If you please." The midshipman received his orders and touched his hat, which he gave to the head boatswain's mate, who touched his hat, and then the calls whistled cheerily. Well, thought Jack, politeness seems to be the order of the day, and everyone has an equal respect for the other. Jack stayed on deck. He peeped through the ports, which were open, and looked down into the deep blue waves. He cast his eyes aloft, and watched the tall spars sweeping and tracing with their points, as it were, a small portion of the clear sky, as they acted in obedience to the motion of the vessel. He looked forward at the range of carronades which lined the sides of the deck, and then he proceeded to climb one of the carronades, and leaned over the hammocks to gaze on the distant land. "Young gentlemen, get off those hammocks," cried the master, who was the officer of the watch, in a surly tone. Jack looked round. "Do you hear me, sir? I'm speaking to you," said the master again. Jack felt very indignant, and he thought that politeness was not quite so general as he supposed. It happened that Captain Wilson was upon deck. "Come here, Mr. Easy," said the captain. "It is a rule in the service that no one gets on the hammocks unless in case of an emergency. I never do, nor the first lieutenant, nor any of the officers or men. Therefore, upon the principles of equality, you must not do it either." "Certainly not, sir," replied Jack. "But still I do not see why that officer in the shining hat should be so angry, and not speak to me as if I were a gentleman as well as himself." "I have already explained that to you, Mr. Easy." "Oh yes, I recollect now. It's zeal. But this zeal appears to me to be the only unpleasant thing in the service. It's a pity, as you said, that the service cannot do without it." Captain Wilson laughed and walked away, and shortly afterward, as he turned up and down the deck with the master, he hinted to him that he should not speak so sharply to a lad who had committed such a trifling error through ignorance. Now, Mr. Smallsole, the master, who was a surly sort of personage, and did not like even a hint of disapprobation of his conduct, although very regardless of the feeling of others, determined to pay this off on Jack the very first convenient opportunity. Jack dined in the cabin, and was very much pleased to find that everyone drank wine with him, and that everybody at the captain's table appeared to be on an equality. Before the dessert had been on the table 5 minutes, Jack became loquacious on his favorite topic. All the company stared with surprise at such an unheard-of doctrine being broached on board a man-of-war. The captain argued the point, so as to controvert, without too much offending Jack's notions, laughing the whole time that the conversation was carried on. It will be observed that this day may be considered as the first in which Jack really made his appearance on board, and it also was on the first day that Jack made known, at the captain's table, his very peculiar notions. If the company at the captain's table, which consisted of the second lieutenant, purser, Mr. Joliffe, and one of the midshipmen, were astonished at such heterodox opinions being started in the presence of the captain, they were equally astonished at the cool, good-humoured ridicule with which they were received by Captain Wilson. The report of Jack's boldness, and every word and opinion that he had uttered, of course much magnified, was circulated that evening through the whole ship. It was canvassed in the gunroom by the officers. It was descanted upon by the midshipmen as they walked the deck. The captain's steward held a levee abreast of the ship's funnel, in which he narrated this new doctrine. The sergeant of marines gave his opinion in his berth that it was atrocious. The boatswain talked over the matter with the other warrant officers till the grog was all gone, and then dismissed it as too dry a subject, and it was the general opinion of the ship's company that as soon as they arrived at Gibraltar Bay, our hero would bid adieu to the service, either by being sentenced to death, or by a court-martial, or by being dismissed and towed on shore on a grating. Others, who had more of the wisdom of the serpent, and who had been informed by Mr. Sawbridge that our hero was a lad who would inherit a large property, argued differently, and considered that Captain Wilson had very good reason for being so lenient, and among them was the second lieutenant. There were but 4 who were well inclined toward Jack, to wit, the captain, the first lieutenant, Mr. Joliffe, the one-eyed master's mate, and Mephistopheles, the black, who, having heard that Jack had uttered such sentiments, loved him with all his heart and soul. End of story 16. Biographical notes. Marryat, Captain F., English author, born 1792, died 1848. In 1806 went as midshipman on board the frigate Impérieuse. He followed the sea until 1830, then devoted himself to literature. He wrote Frank Mildmay, The King's Own, Peter Simple, Jacob Faithful, Mr. Midshipman Easy, Snarleyow, the Pasha of Many Tales, etc. In 1837 he visited America and afterwards published his diary in America. Settlers in Canada and The Children of the New Forest were his last works.
Story 17 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 17, The Club Hauling of the Diomede, from Peter Simple, by Captain Frederick Marryat. We continued our cruise along the coast until we had run down into the bay of Arcasson, where we captured 2 or 3 vessels and obliged many more to run on shore. And here we had an instance showing how very important it is that the captain of a man-of-war should be a good sailor and have his ship in such discipline as to be strictly obeyed by his ship's company. I heard the officers unanimously assert, after the danger was over, that nothing but the presence of mind which was shown by Captain Savage could have saved the ship and her crew. We had chased a convoy of vessels to the bottom of the bay. The wind was very fresh when we hauled off, after running them on shore, and the surf on the beach, even at that time, was so great that they were certain to go to pieces before they could be got afloat again. We were obliged to double reef the topsails as soon as we hauled to the wind, and the weather looked very threatening. In an hour afterwards the whole sky was covered with one black cloud, which sank so low as nearly to touch our mastheads, and a tremendous sea, which appeared to have risen up almost by magic, rolled in upon us, setting the vessel on a dead lee shore. As the night closed in, it blew a dreadful gale, and the ship was nearly buried with the press of canvas which she was obliged to carry, for had we sea room we should have been lying to under storm staysails, but we were forced to carry on at all risks, that we might claw off shore. The sea broke over us as we lay in the trough, deluging us with water from the forecastle aft to the binnacles, and very often as the ship descended with a plunge, it was with such force that I really thought she would divide in half with the violence of the shock. Double breechings were rove on the guns, and they were further secured with tackles and strong cleats nailed behind the trunnions, for we heeled over so much when we lurched, that the guns were wholly supported by the breechings and tackles, and had one of them broken loose it must have burst right through the lee side of the ship, and she must have foundered. The captain, first lieutenant, and most of the officers remained on deck during the whole of the night, and really, what with the howling of the wind, the violence of the rain, the washing of the water about the decks, the working of the chain pumps, and the creaking and groaning of the timbers, I thought that we must inevitably have been lost. And I said my prayers at least a dozen times during the night, for I felt it impossible to go to bed. I had often wished, out of curiosity, that I might be in a gale of wind, but I little thought it was to have been a scene of this description, or anything half so dreadful. What made it more appalling was, that we were on a lee shore, and the consultations of the captain and officers, and the eagerness with which they looked out for daylight, told us that we had other dangers to encounter besides the storm. At last the morning broke, and the lookout man upon the gangway called out, "Land on the lee beam." I perceived the master dash his feet against the hammock rails, as if with vexation, and walk away without saying a word, looking very grave. "Up there, Mr. Wilson," said the captain to the second lieutenant, "and see how far the land trends forward, and whether you can distinguish the point." The second lieutenant went up to the main rigging and pointed with his hand to about 2 points before the beam. "Do you see 2 hillocks inland?" "Yes, sir," replied the second lieutenant. "Then it is so," observed the captain to the master, "and if we weather it we shall have more sea room. Keep her full, and let her go through the water. Do you hear, quartermaster?" "Aye, aye, sir." "Thus, and no nearer, my man. Ease her with a spoke or 2 when she sends, but be careful, or she'll take the wheel out of your hands." It really was a very awful sight. When the ship was in the trough of the sea, you could distinguish nothing but a waste of tumultuous water. But when she was borne up on the summit of the enormous waves, you then looked down, as it were, upon a low sandy coast, close to you and covered with foam and breakers. "She behaves nobly," observed the captain, stepping aft to the binnacle and looking at the compass. "If the wind does not baffle us, we shall weather." The captain had scarcely time to make the observation when the sails shivered and flapped like thunder. "Up with the helm! What are you about, quartermaster?" "The wind has headed us, sir," replied the quartermaster coolly. The captain and master remained at the binnacle, watching the compass, and when the sails were again full, she had broken off 2 points, and the point of land was only a little on the lee bow. "We must wear her round, Mr. Falcon. Hands, wear ship. Ready, ho, ready!" "She has come up again," cried the master, who was at the binnacle. "Hold fast there a minute. How's her head now?" "North-northeast, as she was before she broke off, sir." "Pipe belay," said the captain. "Falcon," continued he, "if she breaks off again, we may have no room to wear. Indeed, there is so little room now that I must run the risk. Which cable was ranged last night? The best bower?" "Yes, sir." "Jump down, then, and see it double-bitted and stoppered at 30 fathoms. See it well done. Our lives may depend upon it." The ship continued to hold her course good, and we were within half a mile of the point, and fully expected to weather it, when again the wet and heavy sails flapped in the wind, and the ship broke off 2 points as before. The officers and seamen were aghast, for the ship's head was right on to the breakers. "Luff now, all you can, quartermaster," cried the captain. "Send the men aft directly. My lads, there is no time for words. I am going to club-haul the ship, for there is no room to wear. The only chance you have of safety is to be cool, watch my eye, and execute my orders with precision. Away to your stations for tacking ship. Hands by the best bower anchor, Mr. Wilson. Attend below with the carpenter and his mates, ready to cut away the cable at the moment that I give the order. Silence there, fore and aft. Quartermaster, keep her full again for stays. Mind you ease the helm down when I tell you." About a minute passed before the captain gave any further orders. The ship had closed to within a quarter mile of the beach, and the waves curled and topped around us, bearing us down upon the shore, which presented one continued surface of foam extending to within half a cable's length of our position. The captain waved his hand in silence to the quartermaster at the wheel, and the helm was put down. The ship turned slowly to the wind, pitching and chopping as the sails were spilling. When she had lost her way, the captain gave the order, "Let go the anchor! We will haul all at once, Mr. Falcon," said the captain. Not a word was spoken. The men went to the fore brace, which had not been manned. Most of them knew, although I did not, that if the ship's head did not go round the other way, we should be on shore and among the breakers in half a minute. I thought at that time that the captain had said that he would haul all the yards at once. There appeared to be doubt or dissent on the countenance of Mr. Falcon, and I was afterwards told that he had not agreed with the captain, but he was too good an officer, and knew that there was no time for discussion to make any remark. And the event proved that the captain was right. At last the ship was head to wind, and the captain gave the signal. The yards flew round with such a creaking noise that I thought the masts had gone over the side, and the next moment the wind had caught the sails, and the ship, which for a moment or two had been on an even keel, careened over to her gunwale with its force. The captain, who stood upon the weather hammock rails, holding by the main rigging, ordered the helm amidships, looked full at the sails, and then at the cable, which grew broad upon the weather bow, and held the ship from nearing the shore. At last he cried, "Cut away the cable!" A few strokes of the axes were heard, and then the cable flew out of the hawse-hole in a blaze of fire from the violence of the friction, and disappeared under a huge wave which struck us on the chest-tree, and deluged us with water fore and aft. But we were now on the other tack, and the ship regained her way, and we had evidently increased our distance from the land. "My lads," said the captain to the ship's company, "you have behaved well, and I thank you, but I must tell you honestly that we have more difficulties to get through. We have to weather a point of the bay on this tack. Mr. Falcon, splice the main brace and call the watch. How's her head, quartermaster?" "Southwest by south. Southerly, sir." "Very well. Let her go through the water," and the captain, beckoning to the master to follow him, went down into the cabin. As our immediate danger was over, I went down into the berth to see if I could get anything for breakfast, where I found O'Brien and 2 or 3 more. "By the powers, it was as nate a thing as I ever saw done," observed O'Brien. "The slightest mistake as to time or management, and at this moment the flatfish would have been dubbing at our ugly carcasses. Peter, you're not fond of flatfish, are you, my boy? We may thank heaven, and the captain, I can tell you that, my lads. But now, where's the chart? Robinson, hand me down the parallel rules and compasses. Peter, they're in the corner of the shelf. Here we are now, a devilish sight too, near this infernal point. Who knows how her head is? I do, O'Brien. I heard the quartermaster tell the captain southwest by south, southerly. Let me see, continued O'Brien. Variation 2 1/4, leeway. Rather too large an allowance of that, I'm afraid, but however, we'll give her 2½ points. The Diomede would blush to make any more, under any circumstances. Here, the compass, now, we'll see. And O'Brien advanced the parallel rule from the compass to the spot where the ship was placed on the chart. Bother! You see, it's as much as she'll do to weather the other point now, on this tack. And that's what the captain meant when he told us we had more difficulty. I could have taken my Bible oath that we were clear of everything if the wind held. See what the distance is, O'Brien, said Robinson. It was measured and proved to be 13 miles. Only 13 miles, and if we do weather, we shall do very well, for the bay is deep beyond. It's a rocky point, you see, just by way of variety. Well, my lads, I've a piece of comfort for you anyhow. It's not long that you'll be kept in suspense, for by 1 o'clock this day you'll either be congratulating each other upon your good luck, or you'll be past praying for. Come, put up the chart, for I hate to look at melancholy prospects, and steward, see what you can find in the way of comfort. Some bread and cheese, with the remains of yesterday's boiled pork, were put on the table. With a bottle of rum procured at the time, they spliced the main brace. But we were all too anxious to eat much, and one by one returned to the deck, to see how the weather was, and if the wind at all favoured us. On deck, the superior officers were in conversation with the captain, who expressed the same fear that O'Brien had in our berth. The men, who knew what they had to expect, were assembled in knots, looking very grave, but at the same time not wanting in confidence. They knew that they could trust to the captain, as far as skill or courage could avail them, and sailors are too sanguine to despair even at the last moment. As for myself, I felt such admiration for the captain, after what I had witnessed that morning, that whenever the idea came over me that in all probability I should be lost in a few hours, I could not help acknowledging how much more serious it was that such a man should be lost to his country. I do not intend to say that it consoled me, but it certainly made me still more regret the chances with which we were threatened. Before 12 o'clock, the rocky point which we so much dreaded was in sight, broad on the lee bow, and if the low sandy coast appeared terrible, how much more did this, even at a distance. The captain eyed it for some minutes in silence, as if in calculation. "Mr. Falcon," said he at last, "we must put the mainsail on her." "She never can bear it, sir." "She must bear it," was the reply. "Send the men aft to the main sheet. See that careful men attend the buntlines." The mainsail was set, and the effect of it upon the ship was tremendous. She careened over so that her lee channels were under the water, and when pressed by a sea, the lee side of the quarter-deck and gangway were afloat. She now reminded me of a goaded and fiery horse, mad with the stimulus applied, not rising as before, but forcing herself through whole seas and dividing the waves which poured in one continual torrent from the forecastle down upon the decks below. 4 men were secured to the wheel. The sailors were obliged to cling to prevent being washed away. The ropes were thrown in confusion to leeward, the shot rolled out of the lockers, and every eye was fixed aloft, watching the masts, which were expected every moment to go over the side. A heavy sea struck us on the broadside, and it was some moments before the ship appeared to recover herself. She reeled, trembled, and stopped her way, as if it had stupefied her. The first lieutenant looked at the captain as if to say, "This will not do." "It is our only chance," answered the captain to the appeal. That the ship went faster through the water and held a better wind was certain, but just before we arrived at the point the gale increased in force. "If anything starts, we are lost, sir," observed the first lieutenant again. "I am perfectly well aware of it," replied the captain in a calm tone, "but as I said before, and as you must now be aware, it is our only chance." The consequence of any carelessness or neglect in the fitting and securing of the rigging will be felt now, and this danger, if we escape it, ought to remind us how much we have to answer for if we neglect our duty. The lives of a whole ship's company may be sacrificed by the neglect or incompetence of an officer. When in harbor, I will pay you the compliment, Falcon, to say that I feel convinced that the masts of the ship are as secure as knowledge and attention can make them." The first lieutenant thanked the captain for his good opinion, and hoped that it would not be the last compliment which he paid him. "I hope not too, but a few minutes will decide the point." The ship was now within 2 cables' lengths of the rocky point. Some few of the men I observed to clasp their hands, but most of them were silently taking off their jackets and kicking off their shoes, that they might not lose a chance to escape, provided the ship struck. "'Twill be touch and go indeed, Falcon," observed the captain, for I had clung to the belaying pins, close to them for the last half-hour that the mainsail had been set. "Come aft, you and I must take the helm. We shall want nerve out there, and only there now." The captain and the first lieutenant went aft, and took the 4 spokes of the wheel, and O'Brien, at a sign made by the captain, laid hold of the spokes behind him. An old quartermaster kept his station at the 4th. The roaring of the seas on the rocks with the howling of the wind were dreadful, but the sight was more dreadful than the noise. For a few moments I shut my eyes, but anxiety forced me to open them again. As near as I could judge, we were not 20 yards from the rocks, at the time that the ship passed abreast of them. We were in the midst of the foam which boiled around us, and as the ship was driven nearer to them and careened with the wave, I thought that our main-yard arm would have touched the rock, and at this moment a gust of wind came on, which laid the ship on her beam-ends, and checked her progress through the water, while accumulating noise was deafening. A few moments more the ship dragged on, another wave dashed over her and spent itself upon the rocks, while the spray was dashed back from them and returned upon the decks. The main rock was within 10 yards of the counter, when another gust of wind laid us on our beam-ends. The foresail and mainsail split, and were blown clean out of the bolt-ropes. The ship rightened, trembling fore and aft. I looked astern. The rocks were to windward on our quarter, and we were safe. I thought at the time that the ship, relieved of her courses and again lifting over the waves, was not a bad similitude of the relief felt by us all at that moment, and like her, we trembled as we panted with the sudden reaction, and felt the removal of the intense anxiety which oppressed our breasts. The captain resigned the helm, and walked aft to look at the point, which was now broad on the weather quarter. In a minute or two he desired Mr. Falcon to get new sails up and bend them, and then went below to his cabin. I am sure it was to thank God for our deliverance. I did most fervently, not only then, but when I went to my hammock at night. We were now comparatively safe, in a few hours completely so, for strange to say, immediately after we had weathered the rocks, the gale abated, and before morning we had a reef out of the topsails. End of Story 17. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.